A lot of critiques and criticisms about Bleach stem from people not really understanding Ichigo's powers. Now, while I have made several videos on the channel talking about Ichigo's various transformations, like the Vasto Lorde form or the final Getsuga Tensho, I haven't really talked about the origins of Ichigo's powers. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the very first form of Ichigo when he acquires his Shinigami powers. Hopefully, through these videos, you'll be able to understand Ichigo's powers better, and you'll be able to appreciate how Kubo links all of this up to explain how Ichigo is a hybrid being. So without further delay, let's begin my breakdown and explanation of Ichigo in his original substitute Shinigami form. Before the video begins, only 12% of the people who watch my content are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy these videos, then subscribe and stick around for more content just like this. Now let's get back to the topic of the video. The first thing to establish about Ichigo is that he has a lot of dormant potential within him, and this is credited to his parents. He is not only the son of a former captain of the Gotei 13, but his mother was also a Quincy. Through his parents, he had inherited Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy powers, and the fact that his father had belonged to the Shiba family, which was a former noble family within the Soul Society, thus explaining some of the impressive feats that he displays even prior to acquiring Rukia's Shinigami powers. During the first chapter, Rukia uses a binding spell to immobilize Ichigo. She explains that it's a high-level spell that only a Shinigami can cast. After Rukia explains to Ichigo that her mission is to kill Hollows, Ichigo hears the blood-curdling screams of a Hollow nearby, but it is evident that Rukia is having difficulty sensing it, as she states that there appears to be something that is obstructing her senses. When Ichigo asks her if she just heard that scream, she focuses and is also able to hear the Hollow screaming out. She immediately recognizes that that was the cry of a Hollow, but it is evident that her senses are scrambled, as she states that she is hearing it through some sort of filter, and she is surprised that Ichigo was able to sense the Hollow even before she was. She is genuinely shocked that she wasn't able to sense the spiritual energy of Fishbone D only up until now. When Ichigo's family begin to be attacked by the Hollow, he gets up and breaks himself free from the Kido binding spell. Rukia is once again shocked as Ichigo demonstrates an impossible feat. He was able to break the Kido spell just with his own power. After he becomes a substitute Shinigami, Rukia realizes why she wasn't able to sense the presence of Fishbone D, and why she had heard the scream of the Hollow through some sort of unseen filter. She states that her senses were being jammed by an incredible force, and it appears as though Ichigo was the source of it. When she was in Ichigo's room talking to him, the entire room was full of spiritual energy emanating from Ichigo, and this is what had confused her. She goes on to say that she has never heard of a human who could see a Shinigami. She has never seen a human break a Kido binding spell, and lastly, she has never seen a Zanpakuto that has taken on such a large size. The large blade that he wields in his substitute Shinigami form represents his inherited latent potential and his enormous spiritual energy. When Ichigo questions Rukia why is it that the Hollow had attacked his family, she states that Hollows are drawn to high levels of spiritual energy, but they are also very opportunistic. She states that because of the feats that Ichigo has displayed as an ordinary human, she believes that his family was attacked because the Hollow was looking for him. Ichigo's spiritual pressure had started to release after he made contact with the spirit of a little girl, the one that he had spoken to at the start of the first chapter. When Rukia is badly wounded and can no longer continue fighting Fishbone D, she questions if Ichigo wants to save his family. She states that there is only one way for him to do so, and that's for him to become a Shinigami. She explains to him that he needs to place the tip of a Zanpakuto over his heart, and she will transfer to him only half of her Shinigami powers. She states that he will only temporarily have the powers of a Shinigami, and this will give him enough time to fight against the Hollow. Typically, she wouldn't have suggested such a scenario, but because Ichigo's soul is so powerful, there is a chance for them to succeed, even if it is very low. When Ichigo pierces the blade through his chest, he transforms into a Shinigami and cuts the arm of Fishbone D. Rukia is shocked to see him in his new form, as she states that she had only meant to give him half of her power, but she had ended up losing all of her Shinigami powers. In this form, he is pretty much wielding a giant version of Rukia's sealed Zanpakuto, and none of the powers that he has here are his own. He is simply borrowing them. We never really get to see what Ichigo's sealed Zanpakuto looks like, since later when he activates his own Shinigami powers, his blade is in a constant release state. We typically see this form when Rukia forces Ichigo's soul out of his body through the soul glove or through the use of an artificial soul like Kon. In chapter 3, we see Rukia training Ichigo to get used to his Shinigami form, he is tasked with hitting balls with hollow faces drawn on them with a baseball bat. In chapter 53, Ichigo confronts Renji when he and Byakuya have arrived to take Rukia back to the Soul Society. Renji notes that Ichigo is wearing a Shinigami Shihakusho, and most importantly, he is wielding a ridiculously oversized Zanpakuto. Ichigo questions if it is big, as he had assumed that it was just larger than Rukia's, but up until now he had nothing else to compare it against. Renji is impressed by the size of his Zanpakuto, as he states that a Zanpakuto is proportionate to the wielder's spiritual energy. He questions whether if Ichigo's power can really be this great. He then identifies Ichigo as the human who had stolen Rukia's powers. Renji is able to easily overpower Ichigo, as he questions whether if his huge Zanpakuto is just for show. Their aim is to kill Ichigo so that the borrowed Shinigami powers return to Rukia, and so that Rukia can return to the Soul Society to be executed. When Renji underestimates Ichigo, Byakuya states that there was a Shinigami who had driven a Menos Grande back to Hueco Mundo, as Renji finds it hard to believe that Ichigo is capable of wounding a Menos. Renji directs Byakuya's attention towards Ichigo's Zanpakuto, as he states that it's an oversized embarrassment, and by seeing this oversized Zanpakuto, it is evident that Ichigo cannot control his spiritual energy, and most importantly, he doesn't know the name of his Zanpakuto. This is when Renji activates his Shikai and cuts down Ichigo. In retaliation, we see Ichigo unleash a large amount of spiritual energy, as he momentarily overwhelms Renji and sweeps him off of his feet. Renji is left to wonder where all of that spiritual energy had just come from. Ichigo was laying on the floor defeated a moment ago. He is puzzled as to the source of Ichigo's spiritual energy, but we've already established the reason behind Ichigo's latent potential, and why he has these sudden bursts of unexplained power. Ichigo not only demonstrated more power in this moment, he had also gotten faster. Ichigo becomes pretty excited as Renji notes that an incredible amount of spiritual energy is flooding out of Ichigo, and it feels really dense. As he is about to cut down Renji, Byakuya intervenes, breaking his Zanpakuto in two. Even after being cut down, Ichigo has enough strength to grab onto Byakuya's Shihakusho. Renji is genuinely shocked as to how Ichigo is still able to move. It is through these small feats that Ichigo demonstrates how strong he is. Byakuya explains that with his two strikes, he was able to shatter the vitals of Ichigo's soul body. In his current condition, he is good as dead. Even if he does survive, he will no longer have the borrowed powers from Rukia. None of Ichigo's spiritual energy, much less the powers that he had stolen from Rukia, would remain. It is here that Ichigo is rescued by Urahara, and when the situation seems hopeless, he offers to him a way to get to the Soul Society, but only on one condition: if Ichigo agrees to train with Urahara for the next 10 days. He had purposefully let Ichigo fight Byakuya and Renji on this occasion in order to demonstrate the vast difference in their power. It was important to talk about Ichigo's battle against Renji and Byakuya, as it demonstrates the true extent or limits of Ichigo's powers while he is in his substitute Shinigami form, which is nothing more than just having borrowed powers from Rukia. While having this form for the first 50 chapters of the story, he was doing nothing more than just swinging a large sword around. He didn't demonstrate any real power or abilities of his own. The only noteworthy feats that Ichigo demonstrated while in his substitute Shinigami form were the rare sudden boosts of spiritual energy, like what he had demonstrated during his battle against Renji. We begin to understand more about this substitute Shinigami form when Ichigo begins his training with Urahara, as he explains that Byakuya had destroyed the source of Ichigo's spiritual energy, and at present, when his soul is forced out of his body, it will not become a Shinigami, and it will be very hard for him to breathe. In his current state, he is nothing more than a disembodied spirit from a regular human being who has no spiritual power. The first task of their training is to restore Ichigo's spiritual energy, as he needs to learn to control his spirit body. By regaining his spiritual energy, he will acquire that control, and the more spiritual energy that he has, then the better his soul will respond to him. The main point of Urahara's training is to ready Ichigo for going to the Soul Society, and to do this, he plans for Ichigo to regain his Shinigami powers. But this method of acquiring power will be very different to how Rukia had shared her powers with him. The powers that Ichigo is about to attain are not going to be temporary. They are his own latent inherited Shinigami powers that he has inherited from his father. While this form did nothing noteworthy other than giving Ichigo a blade that he could use to protect his loved ones, its main purpose served to activate Ichigo's own innate Shinigami powers which he inherited. And we learn more about this as we continue with Ichigo's training with Urahara. While Ichigo was wielding his substitute Shinigami form, and in this early phase of the story, there were constant references to Ichigo's latent abilities and powers, through Rukia noting Ichigo accomplishing impossible feats, and how Renji was constantly surprised by Ichigo because of his oversized Zanpakuto, which visually represents Ichigo's large store of spiritual energy, and he is able to momentarily tap into this to turn the tide of battle against Renji, who had at this point activated his Shikai. So I hope that this this video has helped to explain the first form that Ichigo adopts within the series, and how this was an excellent precursor for things to come. In my next video, I want to talk about Ichigo's Shikai form. We're going to be thoroughly explaining his training with Urahara, talking about how his Zanpakuto is in a constant release state, and the powers and abilities that he demonstrates, as well as more impossible feats that he demonstrates while he begins his invasion of the Soul Society in order to rescue Rukia. In this video, I want to carry on from where I left off, and discuss the training that Ichigo undergoes with Urahara in order to acquire his own Shinigami powers. And upon activating his Shinigami powers, we get the first glimpse of Ichigo's Shikai. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know everything that there is to know about Ichigo's Shikai form. We're going to be talking about Ichigo's Zanpakuto, which is in a constant release state, as well as all of the new techniques that Ichigo demonstrates in this form. So without further delay, let's dive into my breakdown and analysis of Shikai Ichigo. Ichigo's Shikai is first revealed in chapter 67 of the manga and in episode 20 of the anime. Moments before Rukia was taken back to the Soul Society, Byakuya had destroyed the source of Ichigo's borrowed powers. He was left to bleed out and die in the rain. That is until the iconic appearance of Urahara, who not only saves Ichigo here, but also offers him a way to return his Shinigami powers back to him. He explains that Byakuya had destroyed the source of his spirit energy, so now when his soul leaves the body, it won't be in his Shinigami form. He'll be a regular human being with no spiritual powers, pretty much an ordinary soul that is chained to his physical body. The first step of Ichigo's training with Urahara is to first restore his spiritual energy. If he can do this, then he'll be able to control his spiritual body better. The more spirit energy that he has, the better that his spirit body will respond to him. The way that Ichigo is at the moment, he is struggling to breathe, but he needs to get to the point where he can move around in his spiritual body exactly the same as when he is in his physical body. Towards the end of chapter 60, after Ichigo no longer has trouble breathing or moving, and it appears as though he has recovered his spiritual energy, Tessai ends up cutting Ichigo's soul chain and then subsequently pinning him down to the ground. The portion of the soul chain that is still attached to his spirit body is beginning to corrode away. The chains appear to have grown several mouths which are eating away at the remainder of his soul chain, in a process that is called encroachment. In this current state, Ichigo has very little time to waste. This second lesson of Urahara's is called Shattered Shaft. If his soul chain corrodes completely, then he will transform into a hollow. The only way to avoid this is by becoming a Shinigami. This portion of his training is to restore Ichigo's Shinigami powers. He has about 72 hours to achieve this. It is here for the first time in the series that Ichigo enters into his inner world and is introduced to Old Man Zangetsu. He reveals to him that the Shinigami powers that Byakuya had removed from him were those that were given to him by Rukia, but he had overlooked the fact that Ichigo has his own Shinigami powers. Zangetsu goes on to explain that by borrowing Rukia's powers, he had awakened his own, but these inherited Shinigami powers lay hidden deep within his soul, and this is partly the reason why Byakuya wasn't able to detect them. Ichigo now has 72 hours to find the piece of his soul which contains his Shinigami powers. The skyscrapers around him begin crumbling into cubes. Ichigo's powers are in one of these boxes. When Ichigo realizes that he can sense the spiritual energy of the boxes via the soul ribbons, he quickly understands that the box containing his Shinigami powers will have a red soul ribbon. Upon discovering the box, he sees the hilt of his Zanpakuto. Drawing out the Zanpakuto, an explosion erupts within Urahara's underground training facility, as it appears as though Ichigo has restored his Shinigami powers, as he is donning the familiar black Shinigami Shihakusho, but with a strange twist, as strangely enough he is also wearing a frightening hollow mask on his face. Now, I made a separate video where I discussed everything that there is to know about the hollow mask, and why it continued to reappear after Ichigo had gained his own Shinigami powers, so I definitely recommend that you watch my hollow mask explained video too. But as for now, Ichigo has his Shinigami powers restored, but he doesn't appear to have much of a Zanpakuto, as in this initial phase it appears to be exactly the same blade that he was using when Rukia had given him her powers, and it is also in the same condition that it was in after Byakuya had cut it in two. He is using this broken Zanpakuto to fend off Urahara's Shikai. Urahara then proceeds to cut through the remains of Ichigo's Zanpakuto until only the hilt remains. This is during Urahara's third lesson. Ichigo has one simple objective. It's to knock Urahara's hat off of his head. He has a 5-minute limit to do so. It is during this third lesson that Ichigo realizes what Shikai is, as he remembers that Renji was also able to call upon the name of his Zanpakuto. Urahara explains to him that every Zanpakuto has a name. During this part of his training, Ichigo begins to run away from Urahara, when he begins to question why he is running away, and he asks himself if this is all the resolve that he has, and he begins to feel shame that he is behaving like a coward. The man from his inner world appears before him. He tells Ichigo to face forward, as he tells him that fear was preventing preventing him from hearing his name before. He has only one enemy in front of him, and that there is nothing to fear. He tells him to let go of what he is afraid of and to advance forward. If he retreats, he will age. If he feels fear, then he will die. The old man reveals that his name is Zangetsu, as Ichigo shouts out his Zanpakuto's name, as Ichigo finally attains his Shikai, as we get to marvel at the new form of his Zanpakuto. Tessai and the others question the shape of Ichigo's Zanpakuto here, as they state that there is no hilt or guard, and his Zanpakuto does not have the shape of a normal sword. After attaining his Shikai, he is easily able to blow off Urahara's hat from his head, thus concluding his third and final lesson with Urahara. Now these questions in regards to the shape of Ichigo's new Zanpakuto are relevant, and it's all linked together with this idea that whenever Ichigo is in his Shinigami form, his Zanpakuto has a constant Shikai release. Now from the information that we learn later on during the 1000-year Blood War arc, Ichigo's Shikai and his subsequent Bankai that he learns were the result of him activating these powers with a broken sealed Zanpakuto, or one that wasn't properly incorporating all of the aspects of his powers, because we are aware that the manifestation of his Quincy powers, Old Man Zangetsu, was holding his powers back this entire time. So the small fraction that he was unable to hold back had manifested this limited Shikai and Bankai that he uses. Especially from the comments that Tessai makes, it is evident that the Shikai Ichigo demonstrates was an unstable form of a sealed Zanpakuto, thus explaining why it didn't have a proper hilt or a guard, and similar to his Zanpakuto in his substitute Shinigami form, it was oversized. Up until the 1000-year Blood War arc, Ichigo had assumed that he was using his true Shikai and Bankai, but this was far from the case. When a Shinigami is able to communicate and control the spirit of their Zanpakuto, they can manifest the Shikai transformation and the Bankai transformation, and they can also revert the sword back into its sealed state. Renji had told us in chapter 55 that a Zanpakuto can change size and shape depending on the spiritual strength of the owner. The size and shape is changed drastically when a user activates their Shikai, but for the most part, when a Zanpakuto is in its sealed state, it looks no different than an ordinary katana. But because at this point in the story, Ichigo had a pretty unstable sealed Zanpakuto, and he didn't really have a proper Asuchi, which had resulted in him wielding this abnormal Zanpakuto. So in this false Shikai form, Ichigo has several stat buffs. He has a substantial increase in his speed and power, as well as added endurance, which helps him to continue fighting even after he is injured, and to survive attacks which would have previously killed him. It is true that as Ichigo is getting stronger, he is able to endure attacks which would kill ordinary Shinigami, and this is again thanks to his untapped latent spiritual power, which as we know is the life force of a Shinigami. It is after he attains this form that he is able to use the Getsuga Tensho ability. This attack absorbs Ichigo's spiritual energy and condenses it to the tip of his blade. When he then swings for attack, the spiritual energy fires out of his blade, as the attack takes the shape of a crescent moon. While in this false Shikai state, Ichigo uses this attack several times, and he only learns proper control of this ability during his Bankai training, as in chapter 161, Zangetsu had told him that if you call out the name of an attack, then it will amplify the strength of it. The cloth that is wrapped around the handle of his Shikai Zanpakuto can either expand or contract. We see him take advantage of this as he uses the cloth to wrap up any injuries that he has sustained. This cloth is also used as a sheath to wrap around his blade when he isn't using it. We know that when Ichigo had entered into his inner world, he had seen Hollow Ichigo swinging around the sword through the cloth that is wrapped around the handle, demonstrating that it can also be used for long-range attacks. It is after he attains this form that Urahara allows Ichigo and the others to enter into the Soul Society. For the most part, Ichigo is in this form during his battles against Ikkaku, Renji, and Kinpachi, but for him to face off against Byakuya, he needs to learn the second release of his Zanpakuto. And in my next video, I'm going to be talking about Ichigo's Bankai, covering all of the remarks that Byakuya had to say about Ichigo's Bankai when he had first witnessed it, as well as discussing the false nature of this Bankai, and how similar to this Shikai form, it was far from how Ichigo's true Bankai would look like. We've spoken about Ichigo's initial substitute Shinigami form, and the Shikai form that he acquires after activating his own Shinigami powers when he trains with Urahara, and in this video we're continuing by discussing the Bankai that Ichigo acquires during the Soul Society arc, when Yuriichi prompts him that he has no chance of defeating Byakuya unless he knows Bankai. Similar to his Shattered Shaft training with Urahara, he has 3 days to acquire his Bankai, a form that typically requires 10 or more years of training. In this video, we'll be talking about the very dangerous method that was used for Ichigo to acquire his Bankai in such a short amount of time, as well as going over all of the enhancements that he experiences when he activates his Bankai. And lastly, we'll talk about Byakuya's comments that he made about Ichigo's Bankai not being a true Bankai, and what he had meant when he had sensed something very different about it. So definitely stick around to the end of this video, as we'll be covering a lot of key information about this false form of Ichigo's Bankai. Ichigo's Bankai Tensa Zangetsu first debuts within chapter 162 of the manga and in episode 58 of the anime. This form of Bankai is very unique and different from any other, because ordinarily a Bankai transformation is larger than life. It either results in the manifestation of a huge creature like Ashisogi Jizo, or upon activation it completely affects all of the surroundings, like Head Captain Yamamoto's Zanka no Tachi. Ichigo's Bankai on the other hand shrinks his oversized Zanpakuto into a Japanese longsword. In addition to this, we learn in chapter 382 that Ichigo's clothing is also a part of his Bankai, and the condition of his clothing is directly related to the amount of strength or level of Reiatsu that he has. His change of clothing results in him having a slender, cooler appearance, with his Bankai coat also having a red lining, as it flares out with ragged ends, very similar to Old Man Zangetsu's clothing. His thinner, easier to carry sword also has a chain hanging off of the handle. Overall, this false form of Ichigo's Tensa Zangetsu is impactful and very well designed. We know that the Bankai is the final second command of a Zanpakuto, and in order to attain Bankai, the user must be able to materialize their Zanpakuto spirit and to successfully conquer it, so that it is completely under the command of the Shinigami. Materializing a Zanpakuto spirit is the opposite of being dragged into the Zanpakuto's inner world. Instead, you bring the Zanpakuto spirit into the physical world. Usually it takes about 10 years to achieve this, and even after attaining Bankai, it takes several decades in order to master it. In chapter 120, we learned that a Zanpakuto's Bankai is usually 5 to 10 times more powerful than its Shikai form, and this second final release of a Zanpakuto can only be achieved by a select few Shinigami. Because it is the ultimate form of a Zanpakuto, it is reserved to only those who are the strongest or most talented. Even among the 4 great noble families of the Soul Society, not everybody was able to attain Bankai. It is said that only one member was capable of Bankai every few generations, and any individual who was able to achieve Bankai had gone on to leave a lasting impact upon the history of the Soul Society. Now, while typically this process takes decades or even a century, Ichigo and Urahara were the only known individuals to attain Bankai via a much quicker but more dangerous method. On the first day of training, Yoruichi explains to Ichigo what a Tenshintai is. She describes it as a vital spiritual tool of the Onmitsukido. It is used to forcibly materialize the spirit of a Zanpakuto, while the essence of Shikai is to communicate and to synchronize with your Zanpakuto. To attain Bankai, it requires materializing and forcing your Zanpakuto into submission. In order to begin his training, he needs to pierce the Tenshintai with Zangetsu. Ichigo has 3 days in order to submit Zangetsu to his will. When Old Man Zangetsu appears, he kneels down and places his hand on the ground, as he manifests several different Zanpakuto that appear to look like Zangetsu. Among this field of Zanpakuto, there is only one true Zangetsu blade, and Ichigo needs to find this, and it is only through finding and using this blade will he be able to defeat Zangetsu. This training is very intense and rigorous, and Old Man Zangetsu is not holding back. In chapter 128, we see that Ichigo has gone through 18 swords, but none of them appear to be the correct blade. He continues to grab swords that appear to be identical to Zangetsu. Ichigo is stunned, as no matter what blade he pulls out of the ground, it seems to not be the real Zangetsu. He tells Ichigo that all of the blades that are littered across the landscape are all parts of his soul. This whole training exercise is a test for Ichigo to find the piece of his soul that was made for fighting. During this training, Zangetsu emphasizes that he knows very little about his own spirit, and until he has a better grasp of this, he shouldn't even mention the word Bankai. There is no time for Ichigo to rest during this training, as Old Man Zangetsu constantly pushes Ichigo to get back up despite being heavily injured. In chapter 129, Ichigo has gotten through 51 blades. He remains persistent as he continues to try several different blades against his Zanpakuto spirit, but to no avail. Yoruichi is watching Ichigo's training from a distance, as she observes that Ichigo is gradually getting better. He is holding his stance even after his sword is being broken, and he is able to deflect the attacks of Old Man Zangetsu by matching the speed of his blade to that of his opponents. And after this successful block, he was instantly able to go on the offensive. Yoruichi states that Ichigo has come a long way, as before his training he was relying on Zangetsu's strength, but now during his training it seems as though he is learning at a frightening pace and at a frightening level. and from her thoughts we can see that Urahara had predicted that this would happen, hence why he was confident with letting Ichigo go to the Soul Society after he had just acquired his Shikai. He was aware that Ichigo is very talented, and if Yoriichi is accompanying them, then she would be able to help him to acquire Bankai so that he could finally rescue Rukia. In chapter 130, Yoriichi comments that the sword that Ichigo is currently using, he has been able to fight with it for longer than 5 minutes. This is the point where Ichigo's first day of Bankai training ends. In chapter 132, we have some inner monologue from Yoriichi, as she comments that despite the fact that Ichigo is improving very quickly, and he has far surpassed the pace of an average Shinigami, but these improvements only appear to be limited to his combat skills, as his spiritual energy hasn't increased much at all. She questions if Ichigo can truly acquire Bankai within 2 more days. As she thinks about extending his training, she states that it's more than possible to do so, but when Urahara had devised this method of acquiring Bankai, he had stated that nobody else had done this, and it had taken him 3 days to achieve Bankai, but he does admit that if he extended his training time then it would have been dangerous. She recalls that Urahara had stated that Ichigo's gifts are greater than his own, so he should have no problem in attaining Bankai within 3 days. Yoriichi is worried that if she extends the training then Ichigo's soul may not be able to withstand it. During their training in chapter 133, Renji arrives and reveals to Ichigo that Rukia's execution has been brought forward to tomorrow. This adds further pressure upon Ichigo as he has pretty much 1 day to achieve Bankai. He doesn't want to hear about what would happen if he fails at this task, as he exclaims that he will attain Bankai today. In chapter 137, we see that there are several clones of Old Man Zangetsu surrounding Ichigo, as his Zanpakuto spirit tells him that he will not hold back just because time is running out for him. The last time that we see Ichigo training is in chapter 143, where we see him heavily wounded as he kneels before Zangetsu with a broken sword. He questions whether if Ichigo is going to be getting back up again, but Ichigo smiles as he states that he had sworn to save Rukia. He declares that he had swore this upon his soul. In chapter 162, we see that Ichigo was successful in achieving Bankai, and he had made it just in time to stop the execution ceremony of Rukia. It is here where he first demonstrates the results of his training, as we see how powerful he has become when he blocks the Sokyoku with his Zanpakuto, an incredible feat which Soifon even comments upon, as she states that this should be impossible to do. Ichigo's Bankai Tensa Zangetsu specializes in close-ranged melee combat. This false Bankai form also has several special abilities, the first of which is enhanced speed. Ichigo is able to take all of the power and strength of his Bankai and to compress it into a condensed form, as he uses this power to then perform high-speed combat. His speed in his Bankai form enhances his Shumpo, as he is able to create multiple after images of himself because of how fast he is moving. Another feat that he demonstrates is enhanced strength. We see this firsthand when he encounters the Espada Yami, and he was able to cut through the Espada's skin with ease, as well as being able to successfully block a punch from the Espada. Ichigo also has enhanced spiritual power in his Bankai form. Because of the way that Ichigo uses his Bankai and how he compresses his spiritual energy, his Bankai doesn't end up using as much spiritual power as a typical Bankai, and so it allows him to use Tensa Zangetsu for a longer duration of time. The most notable example of this is after Ichigo's battle with Grimmjow, he stays in his Bankai form all the way up until Aizen's defeat, and even if you count his training within the Dangai, he had stayed in his Bankai state for 3 whole months. Now, one of the key signature improvements that Ichigo has when he is in his Bankai form is his enhanced Getsuga Tensho. The blasts that he generates with this attack now appear to be black with a red outline. Ichigo is also able to control the path of his Getsuga Tensho, as well as adjust the power and speed of it. Ichigo refers to this enhanced form of Getsuga Tensho as Black Getsuga. Now, when Ichigo had first used his Bankai in front of Byakuya, he had stated that it wasn't a true Bankai, as he had sensed something very different about it, and he was in disbelief of the fact that a normal human could have attained Bankai in such a short amount of time. A lot of this is explained through what we learn about Ichigo's character as the story progresses, and how he is far more than just an ordinary human. Even in this form, this Tensa Zangetsu was not Ichigo's true Bankai. It was only a fraction of his power, as we learn that Old Man Zangetsu was holding Ichigo back for the majority of the story. Despite this Bankai having been formed from a fraction of his power, it was still a stronger sum of the captains within the Gotei 13. Because a Bankai transformation is such a large spectacle, Byakuya had probably assumed that Ichigo had sealed his Zanpakuto and had tried to refer to it as a Bankai in order to mock the customs of the Soul Society, as he didn't believe that a small Bankai could exist. How could his oversized Shikai blade transform into a smaller blade? A Bankai of this nature is unheard of, and it is understandable why Byakuya was insulted after Ichigo had claimed that this was his Bankai. Unfortunately for Byakuya, Ichigo is just a rare breed, as he is convinced that Ichigo has attained some sort of a Bankai transformation when he witnesses the enhancements in Ichigo's strength and speed. Now, I've always been fascinated by the throwaway comments that Urahara makes within the series, and the comments that he makes about Ichigo's gifts being greater than his own is very insightful, and it's a key bit of foreshadowing, as it proves that Urahara had known everything about Ichigo from the very beginning of the series. His prophetic words ended up being true, as Ichigo was able to achieve Bankai within 2 days, even quicker than Urahara, thus cementing himself as the fastest Shinigami to have attained Bankai to date. Of course, from this point onwards, there is a lot of potential for future growth when it comes to Ichigo's powers and abilities, as what we have discussed today was Ichigo's false Bankai, which was formed only from a fraction of his full power. We only get to see Ichigo's true Bankai right at the end of the series, but until we get to that point, we have several other stages that Ichigo's character goes through, of which include his Hollow Mask, his Vasto Lorde transformation, the improvements that he has after training within the Dangai, his final Getsuga Tensho form, the power that he obtains after learning how to activate his Fullbring powers, as well as going over his training with Uetsu Nimaya, which results in him manifesting his true Shikai and his true Bankai. Despite having made an entire video on Hollow Ichigo, I still often get asked in the comments on my videos, what is up with Ichigo's Hollow Mask? Why is it that he never used his Hollow Mask after his battle against Aizen? Or what is the meaning or significance of the stripes that appear on Ichigo's Hollow Mask? So in this video, once and for all, I want to go over everything that we know about Ichigo's Hollow Mask, including all of the times that it appears within the story, covering all of the variations of his Hollow Mask, and ultimately understanding by the end of the video why Ichigo no longer calls upon his Hollow powers via his Hollow Mask after his battle against Aizen. So let's get into the topic of the video. This is my explanation of Ichigo's Hollow Mask. As we know throughout the story, whenever Ichigo needed to call upon his Hollow powers, he had donned a Hollow Mask. This concept or idea of the Hollow Mask is first introduced to us in chapter 64. During Ichigo's training with Kisuke Urahara, he obtains his own Shinigami powers. He appears with a Shinigami Shihakusho and a Hollow Mask. You'll note that Ichigo cracks this Hollow Mask and immediately removes it. This iteration of the Hollow Mask only appears to have 2 stripes running down it. As you're about to notice, as the story progresses and Ichigo relies upon his Hollow powers more and more, these red stripes increase. There is debate about what these markings on the face of the Hollow Mask represent. Are they a visual representation of how much control Ichigo's Hollow has over his powers? Or do the red stripes represent Ichigo's battle instincts? Some people have also theorized that these red stripes were like a ticking time bomb until Ichigo's Vasto Lorde transformation, as we see that the number of stripes continue to increase the more that Ichigo had summoned his Hollow Mask, and thus finally culminating into Ichigo's Vasto Lorde transformation against Ukiura. The first time that this Hollow Mask begins to form on the face of Ichigo is in chapter 62. Ichigo is given a strict time limit of 3 days in order to activate his Shinigami powers. During this time, a hole appears within Ichigo's chest, and his chain of fate begins to consume itself. A white substance seeps from this hole that is formed within Ichigo's chest, and it begins to form a mask on Ichigo's face, as we see that Ichigo is gradually being transformed into a hollow, and the only way to stop this is by Ichigo gaining his own Shinigami powers. While Ichigo is struggling to gain his powers within his inner world, this Hollow Mask that is forming on Ichigo's actual body appears to differ from the Hollow Masks that we are used to. This Hollow Mask appears to have no mouth, and the lines that we see typically running down from the eyelids are drawn right to the bottom of the mask, covering where the mouth should be. One similarity of this early iteration of the Hollow Mask that we see in chapter 63 is that it also has 2 red stripes running down the left side of the mask. Like I mentioned earlier, chapter 64 is the first time that we see Ichigo's Hollow Mask as we know it. It appears strikingly similar to a human skull, the only difference being the distinctive markings and the menacing slanted eyes, which convey this sense of emptiness. And I would totally agree with this notion that Ichigo appears as a monster while donning his Hollow Mask. For me, the Hollow Mask invokes fear and a lack of control. It is raw instinctive battle power. We next see Ichigo's Hollow Mask appear sporadically during the early portions of the Soul Society arc, where it appears to automatically manifest itself on different areas of Ichigo's body, prior to him being attacked by the enemy, as if to demonstrate that the Hollow Masks are protecting Ichigo from being injured. And we see this firsthand during Ichigo's battle against Renji, which occurs between chapters 94 to 97. When Ichigo is being healed by Hinataro, he discovers that Ichigo's Hollow Mask had protected him from being damaged by one of Renji's attacks. You'll immediately notice that this Hollow Mask that Hinataro had found in chapter 100 appears to have 3 red stripes on the left side of its face. Other than this, it appears completely identical to the mask that was formed in chapter 64. Hanataro questions why Ichigo has in his possession a mask that resembles a Hollow's mask, and he comments on the durability of this mask, that it was able to stop an attack from Renji. Another instance of Ichigo's Hollow mask appearing to protect him against Kinpachi. In chapter 116, Yoriichi reveals to Ichigo that if this Hollow mask had not appeared, then Ichigo would have been cut clean in half. From Yoriichi's questioning, it appears that Ichigo didn't even know that he had this Hollow mask in his possession. We learn that Ichigo had thrown the previous mask away that Hanataro had found, but Yoriichi is shocked to learn that it had reappeared. Ichigo goes on to say that he is going to hold on to his Hollow mask, but Yoriichi demands that he gives it to her. This moment is very vague and mysterious, but it is clear that Yoriichi is worried about something, as she says to herself that she doubts it, but it's better safe than sorry, referring to Ichigo wanting to hold on to this Hollow mask. Yoriichi's reaction clearly proves to us the reader that there is more to this Hollow mask than meets the eye, and it's an excellent setup for a mystery that Kubo slowly intertwines into his story. And again, you'll see that this Hollow mask that we see in chapter 116 has a further stripe on the side of its face. It now has 4 red stripes running down the left side of the face. The Hollow mask next appears in chapter 165 during Ichigo's battle against Byakuya, when Ichigo's inner Hollow takes over Ichigo's body and battles against Byakuya for him. The Hollow mask begins to gradually form on Ichigo's face, but before it can completely form, Ichigo removes the Hollow mask from his face. He doesn't want to rely on any external help, not even from his own inner Hollow. During this time, similar to the appearance of the Hollow mask in chapter 116, it only had 4 stripes on the left side of its face. The only difference is that the Hollow mask did not completely get a chance to form on Ichigo's face. But despite this, it was the first time that we saw this alternative personality that lays dormant within Ichigo manifest, and it certainly added to the air of mystery surrounding the origin and the purpose of the Hollow mask. During the early portions of the Arrancar arc, Ichigo can feel the presence of his inner Hollow increasing, and in chapter 193 an attempt is made by his inner Hollow to take over Ichigo's being, but Ichigo refuses and is then beaten by Yami. We next see Ichigo's Hollow mask appear in chapter 220, while he is training with the Vizards and trying to gain control of his Hollow abilities. During this time, Ichigo's inner Hollow has taken over his body, and he is gradually becoming hollowified. In chapter 222, you can see that Ichigo has taken on this Hollow form. He has the very familiar Hollow mask on his face, and has transformed into what appears to be a lizard-like Hollow. The markings on the left side of Ichigo's Hollow mask have now increased to 5 red stripes. After Ichigo regains control of his body, he emerges from the remains of this Hollow form. He appears to be donning a Hollow mask, but there is a considerable change, as there are now 9 red stripes running across the left side of the mask. We see Ichigo utilize this Hollow mask during his training with Hiyori, as he tries to increase the length of time that he can stay in his masked form. During Ichigo's rematch with Grimmjow in chapter 231, Ichigo dons his Hollow mask. After his training with the Vizards, he is only able to retain his Hollow mask for 11 seconds. What you'll notice, Kubo does a close-up shot of Ichigo's Hollow mask in chapter 231. The red stripes are divided into 3 sections, with the top half of the left-hand side of the mask having 4 red stripes. Through the close-up shot, we see that the middle portion of the left-hand side of the mask has 3 red stripes, and it is easy to distinguish that the bottom half of the mask has 3 red stripes. So during his rematch with Grimmjow, there were 10 red stripes on Ichigo's Hollow mask. At this point, you can only assume that these red stripes represent Ichigo's control over his Hollow abilities, as he deals heavy damage on Grimmjow while his Hollow mask is intact. But the tables quickly turn when Ichigo's Hollow mask cracks in chapter 232, and he begins to be soundly beaten by Grimmjow. We then see Ichigo utilize his Hollow mask in Huecomundo during his battle against Dodoni. The Privaron Espada convinces Ichigo to use his Hollow mask. He desires to fight Ichigo at his best. Ichigo momentarily manifests his Hollow mask, and the markings appear to be similar to the last time that he had utilized it against Grimmjow. And similar to before, Ichigo's power is increased dramatically while he is donning the Hollow mask. He is able to cut down the Privaron Espada Dodoni with one strike. In chapter 280, during Ichigo's final battle against Grimmjow, he dons his Hollow mask in order to protect Orihime and Nell from a Grand Ray Sero that Grimmjow fires towards them. You can clearly see 10 red stripes on the left side of Ichigo's Hollow mask, and I don't know if it's just me, but these stripes appear to be getting thicker and thicker each time that the Hollow mask is being formed. In chapter 282, we get an excellent close-up shot of Ichigo's Hollow mask during this battle. You can see how terrifying
terrifying it is, and it strikes fear into the heart of Orihime, as she begins to be scared of Ichigo. In chapter 344, Ichigo dons his hollow mask in order to battle against Ukiura, and the theme continues as the red stripes appear to be getting thicker and longer, covering more of the left side of the hollow mask. In chapter 350, when Ichigo transforms into his new hollow form, the Vasto Lorde form, it results in a complete change for Ichigo's hollow mask. While Ichigo is in his Vasto Lorde form, there are two black lines running down the left and right hand side of his mask, and this is consistent with the first time that Ichigo uses his hollow mask after he had defeated Ukiura. In chapter 378, Ichigo activates his hollow mask while he is battling Yami, and you'll notice that the color of the stripes that appear on Ichigo's hollow mask are no longer red. There are two prominent black lines running down the left hand side and the right hand side of his hollow mask. The change is so prominent that even Rukia comments upon it in chapter 379, as she states that the pattern on Ichigo's hollow mask appears to be different. She was aware that the markings on Ichigo's hollow mask do change with time, but this time the markings are completely different. Even Ichigo feels that there was something different about utilizing his hollow mask on this occasion, as he states that his hollow mask had felt too heavy. In the same chapter, when Ichigo attempts to summon his hollow mask again, he is unable to. Even Aizen comments upon this in chapter 388, when he states that Ichigo should have surprise attacked him while wearing his hollow mask. It is like Aizen was aware that Ichigo is unable to use it. Ichigo ends up activating his hollow mask for the final time in the story in chapter 404, during his battle against Genichimaru. Once again, nothing changes, and the markings on Ichigo's hollow mask remain the color black. So trying to understand what these markings mean on Ichigo's hollow mask, you can see that the color red is used within Bleach to represent Shinigami powers. Not only this, the inside of Ichigo's Bankai Shinigami Shihakusho is also red, so you can assume that the early iterations of Ichigo's hollow mask which had red stripes can allude to Ichigo's own control over his hollow powers. And you'll note that a change occurs after Ichigo's Vasto Lorde transformation, where the markings on Ichigo's hollow mask completely change and the color also changes. The color black representing Ichigo no longer having control over his hollow powers. There are two instances where Ichigo's hollow mask undergoes a considerable change. The first is after his training with the Vizards, and we see 9 red stripes on the left side of his hollow mask. And this is completely in line with this theory that the red stripes represent the control that Ichigo has over his hollow powers, since the highest number of stripes appear after he trains with the Vizards and gains control of his hollow abilities. And the second major change in Ichigo's hollow mask occurs after his Vasto Lorde transformation. These very symbolic markings that appear on the various iterations of Ichigo's hollow mask can be seen to be inherited in Ichigo's Fullbring form, as he has multiple black markings all over his body along with a brand new Shinigami Shihakusho, and most notably he has this X mark on his chest. And if you followed my videos long enough, then you're aware that Ichigo's Fullbring form has his hollow powers incorporated into it, and thus he no longer needs to don a hollow mask, which explains why we never see him use a hollow mask after chapter 404. Now ultimately this is just my theory on what the markings on Ichigo's hollow mask mean and represent, but I would love to know what all of you think. What kind of meanings and symbolism did you derive from Ichigo's hollow abilities and his hollow mask? Do you agree with my explanation or disagree with it? And is there anything that I missed about Ichigo's hollow mask? I can't wait to read all of your comments on this aspect of Bleach which has barely been covered by anyone. And if you want to learn more about Ichigo's hollow abilities, then check out my Hollow Ichigo character analysis video. In that video, I go into great detail about Ichigo's hollow powers, explaining how they are eventually incorporated into his Shinigami powers and the truth behind who Hollow Ichigo really is. So if you're interested in Ichigo's powers, then definitely check out that video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of the most debated forms within the Bleach manga. Yes, I'm referring to Ichigo's Vasto Lorde transformation. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down what led up to this incredible transformation, while also explaining the abilities that Ichigo gains in this new form, and going over each instance that we see Ichigo's Vasto Lorde form, including his battle against Ukiura, and when he goes into his inner world in order to learn the final Getsuga Tensho, and he encounters his inner hollow with Tensa Zangetsu, and we see that his inner hollow has taken the form of his Vasto Lorde transformation. So my aim with this video is to try to understand and interpret this mysterious form, this transformation that is only with us for a handful of chapters, but leaves us with such a lasting impression. Hopefully after this video you'll be able to understand Ichigo's hollow powers a bit better, as well as completely understanding what the Vasto Lorde transformation was. So without further delay, let's get into the topic of the video. This is my explanation of Ichigo's manifested hollow form, which is referred to as the Vasto Lorde form. Before diving into the topic of the video, I think it's important to go over the different forms of hollows so that we understand the terminology terminology being used, especially when I refer to this form as the Vasto Lorde form, because I know a lot of people will have issue with me referring to this transformation by that name. In chapter 197, Hitsugaya explains to Ichigo everything that he needs to know about Arankars and hollows, as he states that an Arankar is formed when a hollow has torn off its mask. He gets Ichigo's attention when he explains that there are hollows that are more powerful than Menos. To clarify his statement, Hitsugaya states that there are 3 classes of Menos, which are the lowest level of Menos. There are countless of them and they look very similar, with the only difference being that they vary in height. He explains that when Menos Grande are referred to in Shinigami textbooks, it is the Gillians that are spoken of, and the Menos that Ichigo had fought before arriving to the Soul Society was indeed a Gillian. Ichigo is understandably surprised to learn that this indeed was the lowest class of Menos. The Gillian class of Menos are very large in size, which results in them being slow, and they typically have the intelligence of a wild animal, and in general, a captain-ranked Shinigami could easily defeat a Gillian. The next class of Menos is referred to as the Ajukas. They are of course smaller in size when compared to Gillians, and far fewer of them exist. With this level of Menos, you'll find that they are very highly intelligent and are much more dangerous. This second rank of Menos actually give orders to the Gillians. Now the final rank of Menos that we are concerned with and is the most relevant to this video are of course the Vasto Lorde. This is the highest class of Menos, and in comparison to regular hollows, they are far smaller in size, and they are typically the size of a human being. Only a very few of them exist within Huecomundo, but Hitsugaya goes on to explain to Ichigo that Vasto Lorde are far more powerful than even captain-ranked Shinigami, and you can only assume that they are even more intelligent than the Ajukas, which were referred to as being highly intelligent anyway. So from chapter 197, it is made evident that Ichigo knows exactly what a Vasto Lorde is, and that's why it's not entirely correct to refer to Ichigo's transformation as the Vasto Lorde transformation, because it is actually a manifested form of his true Zanpakuto spirit Zangetsu, or in other words, Hollow Ichigo, thus explaining the contradiction between Hitsugaya's explanation and the transformation that Ichigo undergoes. Hitsugaya had stated that Vasto Lorde are actually intelligent. This is contrasted against Ichigo's transformation, where his behavior is best described as a mindless beast. After having read the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we know at this time Old Man Zangetsu was suppressing Ichigo's Shinigami powers, so with his inner hollow actually being his true Zanpakuto spirit, whenever Ichigo had tried to call upon his Zanpakuto in order to give him power, it was in fact his inner hollow that would respond to him. And because his Shinigami powers were being suppressed, the powers that Ichigo had begun to awaken and were being utilized were in fact hollow powers, because his Zanpakuto spirit has this duality of being a hollow and a Shinigami, and when one side is being suppressed, the other was allowed to flourish, thus explaining the sporadic manifestations of Ichigo's hollow mask during his battles against Byakuya Yami and even Grimmjow. That is until he learns to control his hollow mask thanks to the help of the Vizards. This of course leads to the famous speech about the King and the Horse, and at the end of chapter 221 we get the iconic foreshadowing from Hollow Ichigo, as he warns him that as soon as Ichigo demonstrates any weakness, then he will not hesitate to take over and destroy him. And this is precisely what happens in chapter 350. After Ukiura fires a Cero Oscuras through Ichigo's chest, he is understandably left with a gaping hole through his chest, and Orihime is unable to heal him. Orihime then begins to panic and begs for Ichigo to help her, and it is assumed that at this moment Ichigo's inner hollow or his Zanpakuto spirit had taken over, thus resulting in this newly manifested hollow form. From the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we are aware that every time Ichigo was close to death, it was his inner hollow that had manifested to protect him, so it is understandable to assume that this had also occurred here. Now before this transformation, Ichigo says the iconic lines, "I will protect you, I will save you," and most people assume that this is Ichigo saying this to Orihime, but in actual fact, what if this was Ichigo's inner hollow saying this to him, Zangetsu telling Ichigo that he will protect him and he will save him? It is a fascinating possibility that is very easy to make, especially after you learn the truth about Oman Zangetsu and Ichigo's inner hollow. So this hollow form that Ichigo transforms into has long straight hair, which flows all the way down to his waist. He also has a small hollow hole through his chest. This hole has several markings which spread out from it and go over his chest and onto his face. The most striking feature of this hollow form is the different hollow mask that it manifests, as it covers the entirety of Ichigo's head, and it is decorated by a pair of menacing horns. In this new hollow form, Ichigo has several new abilities, which include an enhanced Cero. It is a red-colored Cero which is far more powerful than Ukiura's Cero Oscuras, and it is easily able to cause large-scale destruction, and the only way to stop a Cero from this hollow form is to break off one of its horns. Now another incredible feat which is demonstrated within chapter 350 is the immense strength that Ichigo's new holoform has. He is able to destroy a large portion of the roof of Las Noches with just the swing of a blade. He easily tore off Ulquiorra's left arm, and he was able to crush one of Ulquiorra's most powerful attacks, the Lanza del Relampago. He also demonstrates several abilities which are commonly found within Arrancars, which include the Sonido and high-speed regeneration. So after Ichigo transforms into this holoform, he easily wipes the floor with Ulquiorra. While transformed, he shows little to no mercy, even having difficulty to differentiate between friend or foe, as he ends up attacking Uryu, and before he can fire a Sero in Uryu's direction, Ulquiorra severs one of the horns, which results in the Sero dispersing. The large-scale explosion ends up shattering Ichigo's mask, and he falls to the ground, and thus undoing this transformation and leaving Ichigo permanently scarred and afraid of his holoform. This is after he realizes all of the damage that he had caused after he had transformed, in particular feeling guilt that he had defeated Ulquiorra in an unfair manner, and after he realizes that he had hurt Uryu. Ichigo actually encounters this new holoform that he had transformed into in chapter 410. This is after Tensa Zangetsu pulls out the source of Ichigo's despair, which ends up being his inner hollow, but this time his inner hollow is wearing a mask identical to the one that Ichigo had manifested during his battle against Ulquiorra after he had transformed. After his inner hollow removes this horned mask, he confirms his identity, and this also further confirms to us that it was his inner hollow that had taken over his body during his battle against Ulquiorra, and it is this lack of control that Ichigo is fearful of. Of course, we know that Tensa Zangetsu merges with his inner hollow and ends up fighting Ichigo, refusing to teach him the final Getsuga Tensho. I've always described Ichigo's transformation into this hollow form as a manifestation of primal instinct. It is only after Ichigo loses consciousness that we see his hollow take over, and the result of this is pure instinctive survival. This form demonstrates behavior akin to a beast more than a human. The way that he ends up taking down Ulquiorra is like a predator pouncing on its prey, and actually thinking about it, this hollow form actually behaved and resembled a predator who lives entirely on instinct. We know that instinct plays a huge part for the motif of Hollow Ichigo, and it is the central message that is conveyed through the speech of the king and the horse. When Ichigo demonstrated weakness, his inner hollow had taken over, and the result of that takeover had been foreshadowed when his inner hollow had yelled out the word instinct in chapter 220. Another way to interpret this transformation is to draw similarity to it with tribal warriors. During this transformation, we got to witness a form which demonstrated excellent composure, a being that acts without thinking, a fighter with great reflexes, and possessing incredible characteristics like strength and agility. It is hard not to imagine a tribal warrior when I look at this form, from the ripped, tattered clothing, while also being barefooted and wielding a weapon in hand. In addition to this, you have the markings on this hollow form, which resemble the tribal markings that a tribal warrior would have. And in addition to this, the mask that Ichigo is seen to be wearing in this form resembles a skull, similar to the horned skull of animals that tribal warriors would all too often wear on their heads as helmets. Whether if you're comparing this hollowified form of Ichigo to a personification of instinct or to a tribal warrior, one thing is for certain: this transformation is incredibly frightening. The best way that I can describe the emotions that I feel when I look at this form is with the words cold and lifeless. Through that mask, you can see no eyes. There is no skin on the face. It is simply a menacing skulled mask. And of course, when you look at a skull, the first thing that you think about is a dead body. So I think it's fitting to describe this hollow form as an undead being. I stated at the start of this video that this transformation left a lasting impression on all of us, and it was even captivating enough to have a movie centered around it, as Bleach Movie 4 relied heavily on Ichigo's transformation into this hollow form. So I hope that through this video you were able to understand this transformation a bit better, that a lot of people feel like came out of nowhere. In my opinion, this transformation was foreshadowed excellently by Kubo.
I don't think I'll ever forget the feelings of excitement that I had when I had first saw a glimpse of Dangai Ichigo. In general, Bleach wasn't a show that I had associated with wild, over-the-top transformations. Now sure, it had some in the form of Bankai, but I never felt that they overdid it like how the different Super Saiyan forms were beaten to death in Dragon Ball Z. But when I had first watched Bleach Opening 13, with the intention of wanting to check out the latest opening of the series, I saw a brief preview of Ichigo with longer hair, and what appeared to be a new incredibly strong form. This visual of Ichigo's hair flowing has stayed with me as one of the most iconic transformations in all of anime and manga, but because we see so little of it, we know barely anything about Dangai Ichigo, and this can lead us to have more questions than answers, and to assume that this transformation had come from nowhere without any explanation. In this video, I want to explain everything that there is to know about Dangai Ichigo, including the details surrounding his change of appearance, how Ichigo underwent such a change, challenge, and how he was able to defeat Aizen, who had merged with the Hokyoku and was arguably at the level of a god during their final encounter. So without further delay, let's get into my breakdown and explanation of Dangai Ichigo. So before anything, I want to discuss the changes in Ichigo's appearance after he emerges from the Dangai and prior to activating his Mugetsu form. Chapter 416 is the first time that we see Ichigo in this new form. He is carrying his father over his shoulder and has changed drastically since the last time that we had seen him. Firstly, he is taller in size and has much longer hair as a result of training for 3 months non-stop with holified Tensei Zangetsu. We can see that through his clothes and the shape of his Zanpakuto, he appears to be in his Bankai form, but there is a considerable change that occurs when we pay attention to the handle of his Zanpakuto. We can see that Ichigo has in some way become one with Tensei Zangetsu, as it is now fused onto his arm. In addition to this, the chain of his Zanpakuto has lengthened and is now wrapped around his arm, as his Shinigami Shihakusho has been torn up to his shoulder, further emphasizing the change in how Ichigo is now wielding his Zanpakuto. The final point I want to make about his appearance is that the guard of his sword has also increased in size. So to summarize, two things have changed. Firstly, Ichigo is older and his Zanpakuto is now a part of his body. This change in appearance and form is what we refer to as Dangai Ichigo. He achieves this stronger state of being through training in the Dangai for a prolonged period of time. In chapter 407, Ichigo is giving into despair when he realizes the vast difference in power between himself and Aizen. His father is shocked that Ichigo is actually able to sense the spiritual energy of Aizen. Ichigo had assumed that his father was also able to sense Aizen's spiritual power, but this is far from the case. It is for this reason that he tells Ichigo to follow him, because what other choice does he have? Is he going to sit there and cry about how he can't save anyone? Isshin tells him that there is a reason why Aizen has headed for the real Karakura town, located within the Soul Society. If Ichigo does nothing, then all of the people that he cherishes and he has desired to protect will die. When they enter the Senkaimon, they make their way towards the Soul Society, but their trip is interrupted when Isshin tells Ichigo to stop, as he realizes that he cannot sense the presence of the Kototsu. It appears that Aizen has done something to it. Fortunately, this works out perfectly for the two of them, as Isshin explains that the Dangai is a separate realm which is cut off from the world of the living and the Soul Society. This means that time and space works differently within the Dangai, and one of the purposes of the Kototsu is to stop people from staying within the Dangai for prolonged periods of time. But now that it's gone, Isshin explains that it gives him enough time to teach Ichigo the final Getsuga Tensho. We can understand that time flows faster within the Dangai in comparison to the outside world, so this distortion in space and time gives the Dangai a similar nature to the hyperbolic time chamber from Dragon Ball Z, where one day is equivalent to 1 year in the time chamber. This explains how Ichigo was able to undergo 3 months of training in a short span of time. As for every year that passes in the outside world, it is equivalent to 2,000 years within the Dangai. Ichigo begins his training by sitting with his Zanpakuto placed across his lap, as he is trying to communicate with his blade, as it is the first time that he is entering into his inner world of his own accord. We learn that he has less than 3 months to convince his Zanpakuto to teach him the final Getsuga Tensho. When Ichigo enters into the Jinzen position, Isshin states that up until this point, every technique and form that Ichigo has attained has been through brute force, but on this occasion, he has to truly understand his Zanpakuto and take an alternative approach to progress to the next level. This is because the final Getsuga Tensho is a technique that Zangetsu will not want to teach him. When he enters into his inner world, he realizes that it is completely submerged underwater. Upon noticing a hooded figure, he realizes that it is wielding Tensei Zangetsu. This individual tells him that he does not blame him for not recognizing him, since this is the first time that Ichigo has seen his Zanpakuto spirit in his inner world while in the state of Bankai. Tensei Zangetsu is already aware that Ichigo wants to learn the final Getsuga Tensho, and it is for this reason that he is mercilessly attacking Ichigo. He refuses to teach Ichigo such a technique, despite Ichigo needing to learn it in order to protect Karakura Town. But Tensei Zangetsu states that he doesn't care about what happens to the things that Ichigo wants to protect, and that there is a difference between what the two of them desire to protect. When Ichigo questions why Tensei Zangetsu is not helping him, he tells him to look around him. The towering, hopeful skyscrapers have been replaced by a tiny little town, and the second that Ichigo had begun to despair, the downpour had started within his inner world. world, and it wasn't long before this small town that he desires to protect was sunk to the bottom of the ocean. At this point in the series, Ichigo had stopped moving forward and had lost hope because he became afraid of his inner hollow after the Vasto Lorde transformation. Tensa Zangetsu ends up merging with Hollow Ichigo as he becomes Hollowified Tensa Zangetsu. He explains that the two of them make up Ichigo's power, and this is what Ichigo needs to come to realize first and foremost. Even while refusing to teach him the final Getsuga Tensho and appearing to be merciless, it is evident that Tensa Zangetsu still cares about Ichigo and wants him to stop despairing. Now in chapter 420, when we cut back to Ichigo's training, Ichigo is revealed to have longer hair at this point and appears to be taller than before, and he is more determined than ever to learn the final Getsuga Tensho, despite Hollowified Tensa Zangetsu still refusing to teach him it. It is then that Ichigo realizes that if his Zanpakuto spirit wanted to defeat him, then he would have done so at the start of their encounter. He then begins to sense loneliness emanating from Tensa Zangetsu's blade, and he realizes that the only way to learn the final Getsuga Tensho was never to do so through brute force, and to get his Zanpakuto spirit to submit to him. On this occasion, like his father had stated, he needs to understand the feelings of Tensa Zangetsu. Ichigo tosses his Zanpakuto aside and allows Tensa Zangetsu to run his blade through him. This is the only way the final Getsuga Tensho can be attained, by accepting Tensa Zangetsu's blade. Ichigo feels no pain despite being impaled, and this is because the blade is a part of him, so as long as he chooses to accept it, he will not feel any pain. Tensa Zangetsu cries as he reveals that which he wants to protect has always been Ichigo, and he is aware that by learning the final Getsuga Tensho, Ichigo will lose his Shinigami powers. This is where the secrets of the final Getsuga Tensho begin flowing into Ichigo through the blade that has just pierced him. So now that we know how Ichigo had attained the final Getsuga Tensho through training in the Dangai, let's now try to understand more about the significance of this transformation and try to understand why his Zanpakuto had merged with his arm. Ever since Ichigo was given the powers of a Shinigami by borrowing Rukia's powers, we had come to realize that he has a lot of latent potential. We know that during the 1000-year Blood War arc, Old Man Zangetsu was revealed to have been suppressing Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers, trying to stop him from progressing and continuing to get into battles that would put Ichigo in harm's way. However, when he had trained within the Dangai, both his Shinigami powers, which were represented by Tensa Zangetsu, and his inner Hollow, who of course represents his Hollow powers, had worked together and merged as one. For the first time, both of these aspects of his abilities had found harmony through unifying. This is the significance of Hollowified Tensa Zangetsu appearing. The two aspects of his powers had found harmony, and through this they were able to strengthen Ichigo and help him to transcend to a level beyond a mortal. There are a lot of theories about Ichigo becoming so powerful that he had awakened all of his powers, including his Quincy, Hollow, Shinigami, and human abilities after emerging from the Dangai. While there isn't enough information to confirm this, what I can confirm is that he has transcended and become one with his Zanpakuto. By becoming one with his blade, he understandably had more access to his latent powers. Aizen did say that an individual can reach the level of a transcended being by breaking through the barriers that exist between a Hollow and a Shinigami, and this is why he had experimented with hollowifying Shinigami and turning Hollows into Arankars. Aizen ultimately failed at his experiments and was only able to attain transcendence through the Hokyoku. Ichigo, however, was born from a Shinigami father and a Quincy mother who had been hollowified. He was the perfect case study to achieve transcendence by breaking through the very barriers that Aizen had tried so desperately to do. Ichigo training and actually becoming one with his Zanpakuto is a testament to the relationship that he has with Zangetsu. Ichigo not only became one with Tensa Zangetsu, he had also merged with his inner Hollow, thus allowing him to transcend by accepting both sides of his power. Fusing with his Zanpakuto and attaining harmony between these powers was the key to attaining not only transcendence, but also learning the final Getsuga Tensho. Thankfully, Isshin was aware of this, and by understanding the nature of Ichigo's powers, he had come to the decision to train Ichigo to learn the final Getsuga Tensho, which would have ultimately required him to find harmony with his different powers. Isshin had only thought about this course of action after he had realized that Ichigo was able to sense the spiritual energy of Aizen. Isshin was unable to sense Aizen's power because he doesn't have what it takes to be transcended. Ichigo, on the other hand, thanks to his hybrid nature, does. Through realizing that Ichigo was still able to sense Aizen's spiritual power, Isshin had realized that there was still hope. Ichigo was able to attain transcendence and reach Aizen's level through more conventional means. He did not rely on the Hokyoku, and proof that Ichigo has transcended can be seen through how his Zanpakuto has merged with his arm. This is a similar feat which was achieved by Aizen the moment that he had attained transcendence via the Hokyoku. Now, I hope that this video has helped to explain why Ichigo had to undergo training within the Dangai, and what the significance of attaining transcendence was, and why Tensei Zangetsu had merged with his inner hollow, and why Ichigo had to overcome his despair and become one with his blade in order to protect Karakura Town. I was always confused as to why Tensei Zangetsu and Hollow Ichigo had merged during the Dangai training. I knew that it was significant, but I didn't understand entirely why. Thanks to going through this portion of the story, understanding Ichigo's physical change in appearance and how he had achieved it, I was better able to appreciate the form of Dangai Ichigo, how Ichigo had attained transcendence, how Isshin had known that it was worthwhile to teach him the final Getsuga Tensho at the nth hour. All of this makes sense to me now. If you've been following my channel, then you'll know that I've made several videos covering Ichigo's transformations and abilities. I've explained various topics like Ichigo's Hollow Mask, the Vasto Lorde transformation, and most recently Ichigo's Fullbring abilities. As interesting as all of those topics were, I think they pale in comparison to the confusion that was caused by the topic of this week's video. In this video, I'm going to be explaining and breaking down everything that we know about the ability that results in Ichigo losing all of his powers as a Shinigami, the technique called Mugetsu. By the end of this video, you will know what Mugetsu exactly is. And because we are speaking about Mugetsu, we are also going to be diving deep into the final Getsuga Tensho form, discussing whether if this was an ability that was beyond Bankai, whether if this technique originated from Ichigo's inner Quincy manifestation, as it has similarity to the Quincy ability Let Steal, which we know Uryu had performed during the Soul Society arc. By removing his samurai glove, it resulted in him losing all of his Quincy powers in his final desperate attempt to defeat Mayuri. I'll also be countering this theory with the belief that the final Getsuga Tensho is an ability that is exclusive to the Shiba clan. So let's now begin my analysis and breakdown of the ability Mugetsu. So before we can speak about Mugetsu, we need to first speak about the Getsuga Tensho and the final Getsuga Tensho. In chapter 407, the final Getsuga Tensho is mentioned for the first time in the series by Isshin. While the two of them are in the Dangai, Isshin tells Ichigo that he needs to learn the final Getsuga Tensho. He needs to do so within the space of 3 months. He is advised to gain as much information as he can about the final Getsuga Tensho from his Zanpakuto spirit Zangetsu. After Ichigo enters into his inner world, in chapter 408, Isshin warns him, as he states that Zangetsu will not be pleased upon the mention of this ability, as he recalls that his own Zanpakuto spirit Engetsu had behaved in the same way. He states that their Zanpakuto spirits do not want to teach them this technique, and in due time Ichigo will find out why. So this is all in relation to the final form of this ability called Getsuga Tensho. But what exactly is the Getsuga Tensho? Translated from Japanese, it means Moonfang Heaven Piercer. The moon serves as a constant form of symbolism within Bleach, and from the name of Ichigo's signature ability, we can interpret that the moon is in reference to Ichigo. During his battle against Byakuya, Ichigo explains what the Getsuga Tensho is. It is an offensive ability that at the moment of attack, it consumes Ichigo's spiritual energy, and it fires a wave of high concentrated spiritual pressure from the tip of his blade. Upon being released from the tip of his blade, the attack is magnified and discharged. Ichigo states that this is Zangetsu's power, so it would make sense that the final Getsuga Tensho works in a very similar manner. Instead of absorbing a portion of Ichigo's spiritual pressure, the final Getsuga Tensho absorbs all of Ichigo's Reiatsu at once, and it fires it back at the opponent, thus explaining why it is referred to as the final, and why Ichigo loses his Shinigami powers after using the ability. After Ichigo emerges from the Dangai, he appears completely different. But what needs to be understood is that this form is not the final Getsuga Tensho. This is rather referred to as Dangai Ichigo. In addition to his long hair, a considerable change occurs with his Zanpakuto as it merges with his arm. This Dangai form means that Ichigo has become transcended, and it is for this reason that he can sense Aizen's Reiatsu. Ichigo needed to end their fight quickly by utilizing the final Getsuga Tensho, because at this point Aizen had attained immortality, and he was constantly evolving and becoming stronger, and in order to put a stop to him, he had to utilize the final Getsuga Tensho. This is the form that he had been training to attain for the last 3 months, so it is not just an ability that comes out of nowhere. We learn a brief history of it from Isshin, and we even get to see Ichigo attain this ability from the reluctant merged Tensei Zangetsu in chapter 420. The final Getsuga Tensho allows Ichigo to become the Getsuga itself. As he explains in his own words, in this final Getsuga Tensho, I myself become the Getsuga. If I use this technique, then I will lose all of my powers as a Shinigami, thus explaining what he means by final. Ichigo had learnt this ability in his inner world in the presence of Hollow Ichigo, which is his true Zanpakuto spirit, and the inner manifestation of his Quincy powers. These two sides of his powers had fused and had become a combined being, and this is the individual that Ichigo had to convince to teach him this technique. When Aizen sees this form for the first time, he is in disbelief, as he realizes
that Ichigo has evolved to a plane of existence that is beyond a Shinigami, which is similar to himself. But then upon seeing the final Getsuga Tensho, he frustratingly questions if Ichigo is actually at a higher plane of existence than himself, thus alluding to the transcended nature of this form. You'll notice that Ichigo is no longer holding his Zanpakuto, as he has become one with Zangetsu. Just before Ichigo uses the ability Mugetsu, you'll note that he spreads his hand out, and it results in a black line of reishi forming. He ends up wielding this reishi like a Zanpakuto, as he says Mugetsu, which results in all of his reishi being fired out at once towards Aizen. From this, we can interpret that Mugetsu is the final, true, and highest form of Ichigo's Getsuga Tensho. As we know, Ichigo's Zanpakuto has the ability to draw out his spiritual pressure and apply it to his body as a usable power. This is why Ichigo wears his Bankai. The condition of his clothing while in his Bankai form is directly correlated to the reserve of spiritual pressure that Ichigo has at that moment in time. And like I've explained, the Getsuga Tensho is an ability that pulls on Ichigo's spiritual pressure, and it condenses it into his Zanpakuto and magnifies and fires it towards his opponents with the swing of a blade. Let's continue by adding to this idea that Ichigo had merged with his Zanpakuto during the final Getsuga Tensho. We are aware that the first stage of a Zanpakuto, while in its Asuchi form, is simply a blade that contains a spirit within it that has a strong connection to its user, but the user of that blade has yet to learn the name of that Zanpakuto. It is only until a connection is formed between the user and the Zanpakuto spirit that the ability Shikai is attained. We know that Shikai changes the shape of the Zanpakuto based upon the spirit that resides within it. And lastly, the Bankai is a manifestation of the Zanpakuto as a weapon. So when we speak about the final Getsuga Tensho being beyond Bankai, it is simply a level of fully manifesting the spirit of one Zanpakuto within your own body, while Bankai limits this manifestation just to the actual sword. And of course, this can only be done when the user and the Zanpakuto become one, explaining why Ichigo had to train in the Dangai for 3 months until his arm had physically merged with Zangetsu. In the final Getsuga Tensho form, we know that Ichigo had become a transcended being, because he was able to sense the transcended spiritual pressure of Aizen, which both Urahara and even Isshin could not do. Of course, Aizen had forcefully attained transcendence through the use of the Hokyoku, whereas Ichigo had done so through becoming one with his Zanpakuto and accepting the sacrifice that comes with it. More proof that Ichigo was transcended after returning from the Dangai is that Aizen could not sense any spiritual pressure from Ichigo, which can also lead us to logically deduce that Ichigo had transcended to a plane of existence that was even beyond Aizen's. The final Getsuga Tensho and the fact that Ichigo was transcended are two separate things, but the final Getsuga Tensho could not be performed until Ichigo had transcended, until he had become one with his Zanpakuto. So let's now talk about the parallels that exist between the final Getsuga Tensho and the Quincy ability Let's Steal. Both of these techniques dramatically increase the power of an individual, and they have a very similar consequence in the end, as it results in the user losing their powers. Ichigo losing his Shinigami powers after performing the final Getsuga Tensho, and Uryu losing his Quincy powers after performing Let's Steal. The Quincy ability that Uryu had utilized after removing his samurai glove results in burning the very body of the user, which prevents them from utilizing any form of spiritual attack. But there is an important distinction. Uryu did not lose all of his Reiatsu, but he was still able to see spiritual beings even after performing this attack. This is in contrast to Ichigo, who after performing Mugetsu had burnt through all of his spiritual pressure to the point that it was unrecoverable, thus explaining why Ichigo had not only lost his powers, but his ability to see spiritual beings. The differences here are important as it creates a distinction between the Let's Steal technique and the final Getsuga Tensho. Some people like to draw more parallels to these two techniques, even going as far as to say that the final Getsuga Tensho is a Quincy power. Now the main point that debunks this theory is that Isshin had known the details of this ability, even going as far as to say that his own Zanpakuto spirit Engetsu had refused to teach him the final Getsuga Tensho, meaning that it is not an ability that is exclusive to Quincy. It is more likely that this is an ability that originates from the Shiba clan, as Isshin had demonstrated in chapter 405 that he was also able to utilize the Getsuga Tensho. So let's now talk about the symbolism that exists with the names that Kubo gives to Ichigo's Zanpakuto and his abilities, and how the naming of Mugetsu symbolizes Ichigo losing his powers. Zangetsu literally translates into Moonslayer, or as Viz likes to translate, slaying moon, while Getsuga translates into Moonfang. And the technique Mugetsu means no moon or moonless sky. If you remember at the start of Bleach, the moon played heavy symbolism, as the full moon was the backdrop to Rukia's descent into Karakura Town right at the start of the series. So we can see that the moon is very symbolic to Ichigo's powers. So when the Moonfang, which is the Getsuga, combines with that which slays the moon, which is Zangetsu, it results in a moonless sky, which is of course Mugetsu. To summarize, the combination of Zangetsu and Getsuga results
results in Mugetsu. In his Dangai state, Ichigo has merged with Zangetsu, so he is his Zanpakuto, and thus by attaining the final Getsuga Tensho, he becomes the Getsuga himself, like he states in chapter 420. So when the Moon Fang combines with the Moon Slayer, it results in a moonless sky, Mugetsu. This is the genius of the symbolism that exists within Kubo's work that doesn't entirely translate over into English. There are many more examples of Kubo implementing symbolism with his naming structure throughout the entirety of the Bleach story, but I thought that it would be poetic to end this video on Mugetsu by explaining the symbolism that exists with its name. So at the onset of making this video, I was even slightly confused about the final Getsuga Tensho, Dangai Ichigo, and the Mugetsu ability, but after having done extensive research for this video, I have a newfound appreciation for this ability of Ichigo's. I hope that this video has helped you to understand the final Getsuga Tensho and Mugetsu better. If you have any other theories or points of discussion about what I have discussed, then definitely leave them in the comment section down below. In this video, we're going to be explaining Ichigo's Fullbring powers and his abilities. I want to talk about the various different forms of Fullbring that Ichigo manifests. This is because after Ichigo regains his Shinigami powers and they merge with his Fullbring powers, it results in one of my favorite forms that Ichigo takes in the entirety of the series, Ichigo's Fullbring Shikai form. This shouldn't be a surprise, especially if you've seen the profile picture for my channel. The design for it is based off of Ichigo's Shikai Fullbring form. So in this video, I aim to explain what Fullbring actually is, as well as diving into all of the different ways that Ichigo manifests his Fullbring abilities until he is able to perfect them. And lastly, we will talk about what happens after Ichigo regains his Shinigami powers and they merge with his newly acquired Fullbring abilities. So let's get into the topic of the video. This is my explanation of Ichigo's Fullbring form and abilities. 17 months after the defeat of Aizen, Ichigo begins to have difficulty dealing with his powerlessness, and this is explored during the Fullbring arc, which introduces us to the concept of Fullbringers, and a method for Ichigo to regain his abilities in the form of Fullbring. Humans who are spiritually aware are referred to as Fullbringers, and it is this group of individuals who possess the abilities of Fullbring. These abilities allow them to manipulate the spiritual energy that resides within physical matter. Their powers are made up of the residue that is left behind from the spiritual pressure of hollows. The powers that manifest through Fullbring resemble more of a hollow's abilities than that of a Shinigami's. The reason for this is explained in chapter 433, where we learn that Fullbring abilities can develop in an individual whose parents had survived a hollow attack prior to them being born, and as a result of being attacked by a hollow, the traces of that hollow's spiritual pressure remained within the mother's womb, and this residual energy is passed on to the offspring when they are born. Through the Everything But the Rain flashback arc, which occurs during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we learn that Ichigo's mother Masaki did indeed survive a hollow attack from the Hollow White, which of course was an experimental hollow created by Aizen, and when Ichigo was born, he had inherited the Hollow White, which eventually had fused with his inherited Shinigami powers from his father, thus resulting in Hollow Ichigo, which is Ichigo's true Zanpakuto spirit. But during the Fate Karakura Town arc, we are aware that Ichigo had lost his Shinigami powers after using the final Getsuga Tensho. After reading the entirety of the story, we are aware that just by losing his Shinigami powers doesn't mean that he had lost his Hollow powers. Up until the end of the Fate Karakura Town arc, whenever Ichigo had wanted to utilize his Hollow abilities, he had done so through the use of a Hollow mask. But what the Fullbring arc serves to explain is how Ichigo merges his Hollow powers with his Shinigami powers, so he will no longer need to manifest a Hollow mask in order to utilize that aspect of his abilities. In order to do this, Ichigo needed to manifest his Hollow abilities in an alternative way, and it was thanks to Ginjo Kugo and his group called Execution that Ichigo was able to learn how to manifest his Hollow abilities through Fullbring. The key thing that we have to learn about Fullbring powers is that all ordinary objects within the world of Bleach possess a soul. A Fullbringer utilizes their abilities to manipulate the soul that resides within objects. They can alter its physical appearance as well as manipulate its movements. In chapter 432, Ginjo demonstrates this by manipulating the liquid in a cup to float through the air and into his mouth. He describes Fullbring powers as the ability to draw out the soul that resides in materials and to put them to their use. A Fullbringer can draw out the soul of the asphalt in the ground so that it repels them into the air, enabling them to jump higher. They also have the ability to stand on water by manipulating its form. All of these examples of Fullbring powers being utilized culminate into Ginjo Kugo's final example, as he explains when a Fullbringer comes into contact with a tool or a piece of equipment that is very compatible with them, and it is something that they have learned to master. faster, then they can change its very form. He demonstrates this through the necklace that he is wearing, as he transforms this simple necklace of a cross into a large sword. He explains that this is what is known as Fullbring, and through this example you can understand where the name Fullbring comes from, as it means to bring out the full potential of a tool or a piece of equipment. Ichigo's Fullbring powers are activated through the affinity that he has for his substitute Shinigami badge. His Fullbring powers were awakened after he had remembered the strong emotions that he has associated with the object. The feeling of pride that he had felt when he had used his substitute Shinigami badge to transform into his Shinigami form. This feeling of pride that he had felt had resulted in him developing an affinity for this object. In chapter 436, we learn how Chad was able to manifest his Fullbring, as it is revealed that the source of his powers are the skin on both of his arms. He explains that because he had dark skin, he had faced some difficulty and some discrimination, but because of his heritage, he had never lost pride in his skin. He was always proud of who he was, and this was thanks to his grandfather. Chad had utilized his abilities for the first time when he had recalled his grandfather telling him to be proud of himself. So he asks Ichigo to think back to a time that he was proud of utilizing his Shinigami powers through that substitute Shinigami badge. Ichigo then thinks to himself that he cannot remember a time where he wasn't proud of having his Shinigami powers. Thanks to Ichigo's feelings of pride as a Shinigami, it results in his substitute Shinigami badge releasing Black Reiatsu. This Reiatsu takes the form of his Bankai Zanpakuto. Unlike the hilt of a blade, his powers in this form are primarily used for defense. He can also utilize his powers to absorb the impact of a much larger attack, which is demonstrated in chapter 437. Of course, this is the first introductory form of Ichigo's Fullbring, and I like to call this the badge form. At the end of chapter 444, Ichigo reveals the second form of his Fullbring, as we see that along with his change of appearance, his powers have also evolved. His entire body is covered in a black Reiatsu, and his right arm has taken the shape of a black blade. In chapter 445, it is revealed that Ichigo has a clad type Fullbring. Chad understands that this is similar to Ichigo's Shinigami Shihakusho. When he had transformed into his Bankai, it wasn't just his Zanpakuto that had changed. His Shinigami Shihakusho had also changed, and it had become an integral part of his Bankai. As if you recall during the Fate Karakura Town arc, Ichigo had explained to Unohana that in his Bankai form, the condition of his clothing represents how much spiritual pressure that he has. The true form of his power is when Ichigo is wearing his powers. In chapter 452, after his training is completed, Ichigo unveils the final completed form of his Fullbring. During his final training with Ginjo, when Ichigo was blinded, he was able to see the outline of Ginjo's figure, and this was because he was seeing his spiritual pressure. Ginjo explains that there was a reason behind why he had slashed his eyes and had made him blind. He had intended for Ichigo to realize that the glowing silhouette of Ginjo was him sensing his spiritual pressure, and this was to demonstrate to Ichigo that he is slowly regaining his Shinigami powers. After Ichigo had used the final Getsuga Tensho, his spiritual pressure had vanished, and the remnants of his spiritual pressure had taken its time to slowly gather and build up and lay dormant within him. Ginjo explains that they had helped Ichigo to awaken that spiritual pressure inside of him through the use of the energy that had flowed into his body from his substitute Shinigami badge. He continues to explain that once Ichigo has enough strength to use Fullbring, and after his Shinigami powers return, they will eventually fuse with this Fullbring. He will end up transforming into a form that has more power than a Shinigami. This is of course foreshadowing for when Ichigo regains his Shinigami powers, and they eventually fuse with his Fullbring powers. In chapter 452, Ginjo perfectly explains to us the significance of Ichigo regaining his Shinigami powers now that he has learnt Fullbring. It also explains why Ichigo is so powerful in his Shikai Fullbring form. But before we talk about that, let's cover Ichigo's completed Fullbring form. In this new form, Ichigo has an entirely new outfit. He appears to have a black bodysuit with white armor covering most of his body, and in this form, he is able to transform his substitute Shinigami badge into a machete-like blade. As we know, Ichigo is eventually betrayed by Ginjo and has his newly acquired Fullbring ability stolen from him. When he demands for his powers to be returned to him, he is stabbed from behind by Rukia, who is holding a reishi blade. The fact that he can see Rukia means that he has regained his Shinigami powers, as we learn that the blade that he was stabbed with contained the reishi of several different Shinigami. After regaining his Shinigami powers, Ichigo's appearance changes significantly. You can see that his Fullbring powers have merged with his Shinigami powers, as he has Fullbring markings all over his body, in particular the black X markings on his wrist and his chest. In addition to this, Ichigo's Zanpakuto also takes up a brand new form, and this is of course credited to the traces of Ichigo's Fullbring that were left behind after Ginjo had stolen his powers. The entire blade is reshaped. The base of his Zanpakuto now has a silver hilt with grey wrappings running all the way down it. In chapter 457, Ginjo explained a scenario where a former Shinigami who obtains Fullbring eventually has the remnants of their Shinigami power merge with their completed Fullbring. But what happens to Ichigo at the end of the Fullbring arc is the complete opposite. He ends up becoming a former Fullbringer with remnants of Fullbring power, who merges with a full Shinigami, as Ichigo regains all of his Shinigami powers thanks to the Reishi blade, and these Shinigami powers end up fusing with the remnants of Ichigo's Fullbring powers, and this results in Ichigo now having a completely altered appearance. And this is explained to us in issue number 8 of Weekly Shonen Jump, which was released in 2012. A lot of people criticize the Fullbring arc, but in my opinion it's one of my favourite arcs told within Bleach, and I'm fairly confident in saying that most people who dislike this arc don't really understand the significance of it in terms of developing Ichigo as a character, explaining not only how he regains his powers, but how he does so in a more enhanced manner. I for one remember that a lot of people who are reading Bleach didn't understand the significance of the changes that appeared on Ichigo's clothing or on his Zanpakuto through the various different forms that he takes up within the story. But after analysing and breaking down the story, we can see that each change that Kubo does in Ichigo's character design is very significant and it has a meaning behind it. When you understand how Kubo had several pieces in play that he put together right towards the end, and it resulted in Ichigo's Fullbring Shinigami form, it's exactly the reason why I love the Fullbring arc. A lot of people pay attention to how Ginjo Kugo was an obvious villain, while completely overlooking how Ichigo went from having no power to having more power than ever before right at the end of this arc. So what did all of you think about my explanation of Ichigo's Fullbring powers? Do you now understand what Fullbring is, and why Ichigo's outfit had changed at the end of the Fullbring arc? Let me know if there were any points about Fullbringers or Ichigo's Fullbring powers that I have forgotten to mention in this video. We have spoken extensively about Ichigo's various forms and abilities. However, I have barely touched upon his Quincy powers that he inherits from his mother Masaki. We learned that Ichigo's Quincy side had dominated over his Shinigami and Hollow powers, limiting how much of his latent potential that he could utilize. Old Man Zangetsu's true identity was revealed to be the inner manifestation of his Quincy powers. These Quincy powers and abilities for the majority of the series were locked away, and they were only manifested a couple of times subconsciously in order to protect Ichigo. Old Man Zangetsu was against Ichigo becoming a Shinigami, because he had wanted to protect him from growing his powers and getting involved in life-threatening battles. He held the key to Ichigo's hybrid Hollow, Quincy, and Shinigami powers. Gradually, he had started to release his Shinigami and Hollow powers, but this was after his heart had begun to waver once he had seen how determined Ichigo was to become stronger and to protect his loved ones. Now, despite this, he was only allowing Ichigo to use a small fraction of his full power, and he had restricted the use of his Quincy powers, even going as far as to not reveal to him that he has a totally different aspect of his powers. His inner Hollow had in fact wanted to help Ichigo to utilize his full power. This explains why he always showed off and demonstrated how Ichigo's powers should be used whenever he had the chance to. His methods were more aggressive, but they served to teach him the proper use of his Shinigami powers, since his inner Hollow was in fact his true Zanpakuto spirit. Now, in this video, I want to focus on Ichigo's Quincy powers, explaining all of the instances when they had manifested subconsciously to protect Ichigo, including how he had obtained his true dual-wielding Zanpakuto and the resultant Quincy powers that he obtains in this new form. So join me as we break down and analyze the very briefly seen Quincy powers of Ichigo. During the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we learned that Old Man Zangetsu represented Ichigo's Quincy powers. He was an inner manifestation of these abilities, who takes up the physical form of Yhwach from 1000 years ago. Aizen had even foreshadowed that there was more to Ichigo in chapter 397, when he had said that he was born special. He is aware that Ichigo is the son of a Shinigami and a Quincy who just so happens to be hollified. Additional foreshadowing about his Quincy heritage is seen when Ichigo first enters his inner world and cannot hear Old Man Zangetsu stating his real name. It is noticeably blacked out. Also in chapter 110, when his inner Hollow tells Ichigo that this time his enemy is himself, we see him smiling, but within the reflection of his sword, we see Hollow Ichigo's saddened expression, revealing that there is more to him than meets the eye. This subtle level of foreshadowing is easy to overlook, and I'm sure that it's even more difficult to translate over to the anime. One of the biggest hints that was hidden in plain sight that Ichigo was part Quincy was his bedsheet covers. The blue sheets with the white Quincy cross, which literally were there since the very beginning of the story. And in regards to the earliest instance of him demonstrating Quincy powers is when Rukia had intended to transfer only a small portion of her powers to Ichigo, but instead all of her powers ended up being given to him. Now this
is a stretch, but it demonstrates that Ichigo has the Quincy ability to rapidly absorb reishi. When Ichigo battles against his inner hollow during the Arrancar arc, he constantly tells Ichigo that he is the real Zangetsu. This is hinting that Old Man Zangetsu is not his true Zanpakuto spirit. One of the biggest pieces of foreshadowing occurs after Ichigo is cut down by Kinpachi, and his wound is bleeding profusely. Old Man Zangetsu utilizes Ichigo's Quincy powers to appear before him from the shadows. He even uses these shadows to take him into his inner world. During Ichigo's battle against the Sternritter Eben, he states that these shadows only hide the chosen ones, so those that Yhwach chooses, and the Quincy, meaning that Ichigo being taken into the shadow created by Old Man Zangetsu proves that he is a chosen one, or in other words, a Quincy. Old Man Zangetsu intervenes in chapter 112 by using Blut Veen, which restricts blood flow, thus temporarily stopping his bleeding. When Ichigo gets back up, Old Man Zangetsu is behind him, and after he places his hand on the hilt of his Zanpakuto, Ichigo's spiritual pressure undergoes an immense boost, which proves that he had pumped his Quincy Reiatsu through his blade. Old Man Zangetsu had temporarily lended him his Quincy powers. At this point, Ichigo didn't even know that he had Quincy powers, and he never trained to use them, so it is important for us to understand that it was Old Man Zangetsu who is using his Quincy powers to perform abilities like Blut Veen or go into the shadows for him. Another fascinating instance that foreshadows Ichigo being a part Quincy is Ichigo's proficiency at being able to visualize spirit ribbons during the Substitute Shinigami arc. This is something that Rukia states would take an ordinary Shinigami a long time to train and properly use. The fact that he was able to visualize spiritual pressure as ribbons with ease indicates that there is more to him than meets the eye. Speaking of the first story arc, when the Menos Grande appears within Karakura town and Ichigo has to work together with Uryu to stop it, he even ends up blocking and absorbing the Sero fired by the Menos, thus allowing him to fire it straight back at it. Even during the early instances of him firing his Getsuga Tencho, we see his Zanpakuto absorb the reishi around the blade prior to it being fired. Now, during my explanation of Mugetsu, I'd spoken about how the final Getsuga Tencho looked very similar to the Quincy ability Let Steal. Both of these techniques cause the user to lose their respective powers. Admittedly, a lot of these examples that I have given of Ichigo demonstrating Quincy powers are merely theories and speculation, and we don't really get a solid confirmation of this side to his powers until the 1000-Year Blood War arc. His Quincy powers had laid dormant until his battle against Killge. They had actually activated while he was trapped within his prison. These powers had manifested when Yhwach had tried to cut through his throat at the end of chapter 513. Ichigo has subconsciously activated the Blut Veen defensive ability, leading to the shocking revelation that he is part Quincy. In chapter 514, to ensure that he had in fact used Blut Veen, Yhwach strikes Ichigo again, which reveals the glowing blue veins on Ichigo's forearm, which of course are indicative of Blut Veen. He regrets that he had sent out a pure-blooded Quincy to stop Ichigo in Huecamundo. He states that fighting against Killge had activated the memories that lay dormant within his spiritual pressure. While he was trapped within Killge's prison, Ichigo released his spiritual pressure beyond its limits while he remained in contact with the prison, causing Killge's spiritual pressure to slowly flow into the depths of Ichigo's soul. Now, this had in fact awakened the memory of his dormant Quincy powers, explaining how he was able to escape Killge's prison. Now, Ichigo and us as the reader are shocked at what this all implies, as Yhwach states that he knows nothing about his own mother. In chapter 541, after Ichigo learns that he has an imposter within his inner world, Old Man Zangetsu reveals that he is the manifestation of his Quincy powers. He explains that he had acted as the center of all of his powers, effectively controlling how much access Ichigo had to all of his different abilities and powers. But by the end of the chapter, he releases the hold that he has over Ichigo, allowing him to use all of his powers to the fullest of their potential. After Ichigo has his Zanpakuto reforged, he appears with his true dual-bladed Shikai. We learn that his Quincy powers are represented by the smaller blade that he holds in his right hand. In this form, his Quincy and Hollow powers have now come into balance with each other, and later, when Ichigo goes to confront Yhwach, Ichigo kills the Soul King. This is because the Quincy blood that is flowing through him compels him to kill the Soul King. This is all thanks to the will of Yhwach that is passed down to all Quincy, as he does not accept the existence of the Soul King. This desire is so strong that it manifests in every other Quincy. Towards the end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Ichigo was able to shift the balance of his power by awakening his inner hollow, by surging his Quincy powers in order to transform him into a new merged hollow form that all of us know as Ichigo's Horn of Salvation form. Now, for the most part, this pretty much sums up everything that we learn about Ichigo's Quincy powers in the series, and I am honestly hoping that we get to see more of these powers during the events of the Hell arc, which take place after the epilogue of Bleach. In hindsight, when we look look back at what Aizen had to say about Ichigo during the Fate Karakura Town arc, we realize that he was right when he had stated that Ichigo was born special. The protagonist of Bleach arguably has the potential to become the most powerful character in the series. He is similar to the Soul King, because within Can't Be Your Own World, we learn that Fullbring, Shinigami, and Quincy powers had all originated from the Soul King. He literally has all of these powers within him, which is similar to the god of their world, before he had become the linchpin of reality. Ichigo has inherited Shinigami powers from his father, who is also a descendant of the noble Shiba family. He inherited his Quincy and Hollow powers from his mother, who was born a pure-blooded Quincy, who had become tainted by the Hollow White. Ichigo demonstrates Shinigami, Vizard, Fullbring, and Quincy powers because of the unique circumstances of his birth. It had taken a while for him to understand each aspect of his powers, but eventually he earned the approval of Old Man Zangetsu and his inner hollow. The restriction on his powers were lifted, and he was able to manifest his true Zanpakuto. This had all resulted in his dual-bladed, constantly released true Shikai and his true Bankai. Ichigo's powers and forms are really extensive, but is it surprising when he literally embodies all aspects of power within him? His hybrid Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy powers manifest in many different ways. On this channel, I've made an effort to dive into every transformation and power that Ichigo exhibits within Bleach. I have now reached the most pivotal transformation that literally brings all sides of his power together in a new all-powerful form. Ichigo's true Shikai was revealed along with so many details about Ichigo's heritage during the 1000-year Blood War arc. In this video, I want to focus on the impactful dual-bladed Shikai that Ichigo awakens after Old Man Zangetsu releases the limits on his power, and after Nimaiya, the creator of the Zanpakuto, personally reforges his blade for him. So without further delay, let's dive into my explanation of Ichigo's true Shikai. Ichigo's dual-bladed Shikai is first revealed in chapter 547. I remember the first time having read this chapter and feeling absolutely shocked at seeing Ichigo holding two separate blades. The process of restoring Ichigo's Zanpakuto had begun after his Bankai Tensai Zangetsu was broken by Hashward during the Quincy's first invasion of the Soul Society. When Ichigo was taken up to the royal palace and had arrived within Uetsu Nimaiya's domain, he was tasked with finding an Asuchi that would be willing to submit to him. However, out of a sea of potential options, they had all rejected Ichigo. Not a single one of them had deemed him worthy of being their master. There was a fundamental reason behind why this had occurred. It was because Ichigo was not at peace with the demons from his past. Additionally, he was far from being able to utilize his full potential, because he knows nothing about Hollow Ichigo and Old Man Zangetsu, the two spirits that reside within him. Uetsu Nimaiya had taken drastic measures to nudge Ichigo in the right direction. He knew that from the get-go, Ichigo had an imbalanced or incomplete version of his Zanpakuto. This explains why Renji and Ichigo both were picked to go to the royal palace. Renji was using an incomplete version of his Bankai, while Ichigo was wielding an incomplete form of his entire Zanpakuto. At the end of chapter 527, after 3 days and 3 nights, Ichigo had failed to submit an Asuchi. Despite him pleading with Nimaiya for more time, he deemed him to be a failure. He knows that no matter how much he tries, he will never be chosen by an Asuchi in his current state. He tells him that he is no longer a Shinigami, so he has no business being here. He is effectively told to never come back to the Soul Society again because he doesn't have a Zanpakuto, so he is nothing more than an ordinary human. Nimaiya decides that he is not going to fix Zangetsu for him, since he isn't a real Shinigami. He still, however, commends Ichigo for the fact that he was able to achieve so much without having a real Asuchi. He tells him that he needs to go back to his roots. The Bleach 1000-year Blood War arc anime trailer actually references this quote, as they pay homage to it with the Revert Your Roots line, which was seen during the first trailer that was released of the new anime. Nimaiya knows a lot about Ichigo and his circumstances, and this is why he is deliberate with his actions. He tells himself that Ichigo needs to learn about his roots, even if the end result is that he never steps foot within the Soul Society again. He is fully aware of his troubled origin. He knows the reason why he was born special, and the reason why Ichigo has never had a proper Asuchi, thus explaining why he has not yet formed a proper bond with his Zanpakuto. As Nimaiya had stated, if a Zanpakuto is not loved by its owner, then it is prone to being easily broken. We learn that an Asuchi is a nameless Zanpakuto that is created by Nimaiya, and every Shinigami who joins the Gotei 13 is given one. While this blade is carried around, the wielder's soul begins to imprint itself onto this nameless Zanpakuto, and it eventually forms a unique Zanpakuto spirit that perfectly complements the soul of its owner. This occurs after eating, sleeping, and fighting alongside one Zanpakuto for a considerable amount of time. It results in a close bond forming between the blade and its master. master. Nimaya states that because Renji and Ichigo had neglected their Zanpakuto, it has angered all of the Asuchi surrounding them, thus explaining why they had struggled so much to submit an Asuchi to their will, because all of the nameless Zanpakuto are reluctant to pair up with a master who will neglect them. In chapter 529, Nimaya asks Renji why he didn't say anything when he had sent Ichigo back to Karakura Town. Renji responds by saying that Nimaya knows the state of every Asuchi that he has created, and because he is the creator of the Zanpakuto, his decisions are frankly unquestionable. Nimaya didn't say or do anything wrong here. Factually speaking, Ichigo never had a proper Asuchi. He was wielding a Zanpakuto without one, which means that he wasn't a real Shinigami. You have to remember that Nimaya had only agreed to reforge the Zanpakuto if both of them were able to submit at least one Asuchi to their will. Renji was already aware at the onset of this challenge that Ichigo would not be able to complete it. Nimaya reveals that the only way that Ichigo can acquire his own Asuchi is if he learns and accepts where his soul lies, and this leads into one of the biggest mysteries of the entire series, which is ultimately Ichigo's genetic lineage, which finally will explain why he was born special. Ichigo is a heavily conflicted character who struggles to come to terms with his past. After he learns about the way that he was born, how he has inherited powers from a Shinigami and a holified Quincy, he ends up returning to Nimaya's palace. After he finds inner harmony and he learns to accept himself, every Asuchi kneels before him, as they recognize him at last. When Ichigo picks one of the nameless Zanpakuto, it ends up transforming into a form that resembles Hollow Ichigo. Nimaya then proceeds to reforge his Zanpakuto as he tells Ichigo to bid farewell to his former Zanpakuto Zangetsu. He goes on to comment about Ichigo's surprise when he had first seen the form that his Asuchi had taken after he had touched it. He reveals that the source of Ichigo's Shinigami powers is his inner hollow. This is his real Zanpakuto spirit. The inner hollow that resides within Ichigo was created from an experimental hollow that Aizen had made by combining a Shinigami with a hollow, thus explaining why in terms of composition, Hollow Ichigo is very similar to an Asuchi. Nimaya also tells Ichigo that Old Man Zangetsu is not his real Zanpakuto spirit. He is in fact a manifestation of his latent Quincy abilities. Up until this point in the story, Ichigo was wielding a Zanpakuto made up of his Shinigami and hollow powers, but when Nimaya ended up reforging his blade using a real Asuchi, he was then able to use all aspects of his power. During this time, Ichigo had entered into his inner world and had spoken to Old Man Zangetsu. This is where he had learnt about the true intentions of Old Man Zangetsu as he comes to terms with his heritage, and he finally understands the spirits that reside within his soul. His true Zanpakuto and powers were being suppressed by Old Man Zangetsu, but once he finally had lifted the restrictions placed upon his powers, Ichigo was able to use his Quincy, Hollow and Shinigami powers, which are represented by his dual-bladed, constantly released Shikai. One of his blades is the same size as his previous Zanpakuto. This longer blade represents Ichigo's combined Hollow and Shinigami powers. These are sourced from Hollow Ichigo, while on the other hand, the shorter second blade represents his newly activated Quincy powers, which are sourced from Old Man Zangetsu. Similar to his false Shikai, Ichigo's true Shikai is in a constantly released state. He also carries forward abilities that he was able to use in the past, but they are powered up in this new form, like his signature Getsuga Tensho that he fires. In general, this attack allows Ichigo to absorb his Reiatsu into his blade as he fires it back out in a condensed wave of energy from the tip of his blade. This energy is also amplified at the moment of release. His true Zanpakuto allows Ichigo to fire a Getsuga Tensho with minimal effort, because now he simply needs to point his blade towards his target and just gesture a light cutting motion for the attack to be fired. When he fires the attack from his larger blade, it appears in a black color, and it seems to be more powerful than a Getsuga Tensho fired from the shorter blade. This is thanks to the Getsuga Tensho being made up of his Hollow and Shinigami powers. He is also able to use a variation of this attack called Getsuga Jujisho, which allows him to fire a Getsuga Tensho with both of his blades. He fires them one after the other, creating a cross-shaped attack as we see in chapter 583. The attack was powerful enough to critically wound a Sternritter. Within his true Shikai state, he is able to holofy into his Horn of Salvation form by adjusting the energy flow of his powers.
Disappointing, anticlimactic, and lackluster are a few words that I'd use to describe Ichigo's merged holified form, which fans have dubbed as the Horn of Salvation. This transformation occurred out of nowhere and had taken a lot of people by surprise. But the problem with the Horn of Salvation is that some people don't really understand where this form came from, and why Yhwach was so afraid of Ichigo's Bankai when he had activated it, donning the Horn of Salvation. Fans had immediately loved of this form because of how reminiscent it was to Ichigo's Vasto Lorde form, as well as its resemblance to holified Tensa Zangetsu. Now, we don't know the full extent of Ichigo's abilities and powers when he has activated his Bankai in his Horn of Salvation form, but we do get to see him for a handful of chapters with his Shikai in this form. It is easy to get confused when it comes to Ichigo's powers, transformations, and abilities, and it's because Kubo doesn't really spoon feed you a lot of the information regarding them. It was only recently through Kubo's fan club that we got some answers regarding the form of his Zanpakuto at the end of the series. The answers really helped to clarify what had happened after Yhwach had stolen Ichigo's Hollow and Quincy powers, and whether if Ichigo can only wield one Zanpakuto as opposed to being a dual wielder. So in this video, we're going to try and draw out as much information as possible from the manga in order to understand Ichigo's Horn of Salvation form as much as possible. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how he was able to achieve this form, what powers or enhancements he had attained while in this form, and what abilities he had utilized against Yhwach while he was donning the Horn of Salvation. So without further delay, let's get into the topic of the video. This is my explanation of Ichigo's Horn of Salvation. The Horn of Salvation form debuts right at the end of the manga in chapter 675. At this point of the series, Ichigo knows the truth about the source of his Shinigami powers, as well as the fact that he has inherited Quincy powers from his mother. He comes to face Yhwach with a reforged Zanpakuto. Now, up until this point in the series, we haven't seen Ichigo utilize his inner hollow since the Arrancar arc. At that time, Old Man Zangetsu, who is revealed to be a representation of his Quincy powers, had been suppressing Ichigo's full potential, only letting him utilize a fraction of his true power. But with Old Man Zangetsu no longer in the picture, this means that a change will occur when Ichigo activates his hollow powers. When Ichigo had reforged his Zanpakuto into two blades, it had resulted in his hollow powers and his Quincy powers coming into balance with each other. But as Ichigo explains in chapter 676, this balance can be disrupted, which results in Ichigo merging with his inner hollow, and the outcome is this powerful transformation called the Horn of Salvation. What we'll do now is go through all of the chapters that we see Ichigo using this form. In chapter 675, during his battle against Yhwach, Ichigo is assisted by Orihime, who heals him and puts up shields to protect him. When it appears that Ichigo is being pushed into a corner, he reveals that he has another trick up his sleeve. We are aware that Ichigo is wielding two Zanpakuto at this point. He is in his true Shikai form. The smaller blade is a representation of Ichigo's Quincy powers, while the larger blade represents Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers. Ichigo states that there is somebody who he had wanted to wake up. He is of course referring to his inner hollow. He awakens him by pumping large amounts of Quincy spiritual pressure, which results in the balance between the two powers being disrupted. And this is visually conveyed to us through Ichigo's larger Zanpakuto beginning to turn white. When the dust settles, we see Ichigo in this new form. He has black stripes running down his shoulder and his chest, as well as the black stripes covering the left side of his face, and with the whites of his left eye also turning black. And this titular Horn of Salvation appears on the left side of his head. It is incredibly designed and it is so reminiscent of the Vasto Lorde form, but the difference here is that Ichigo is completely within his senses. At the start of chapter 676, this transformation reminds Orihime of the Vasto Lorde form, but Ichigo looks over to her and smiles and reassures her that he is still himself. Yhwach comments on his appearance, stating that Ichigo appears like a hollow, and he asks whether if Ichigo's hollow has fused together with his powers. Ichigo elaborates as he states that the Quincy powers that he had inherited from his mother had manifested in Old Man Zangetsu, and the hollow that resides within him had fused with his Shinigami powers that he had inherited from his father. And while these powers were in equilibrium, it was possible to forge them together as Zangetsu into two blades. Ichigo states that after achieving balance, it appears as though his inner hollow has started to behave himself. So he had theorized that if he tips the balance of his powers, he should be able to bring forth his inner hollow, but in a more controlled manner, which is completely the opposite of his Vasto Lorde transformation. He states that in the past, when he had exerted his Shinigami or hollow powers, it had resulted in his inner hollow manifesting, and as for now, his inner hollow appears to have merged together with the rest of his powers. So theoretically, Ichigo should be able to call him out at will, but because he has only recently achieved this balance with his powers, he is nowhere near perfecting it. So the only way that he could bring forth his inner hollow was with some help from his Quincy powers. So it is for this reason that he had awakened his inner hollow and achieved the Horn of Salvation form by pumping large amounts of Quincy spiritual pressure. So with his larger blade having turned completely white, Ichigo puts away the shorter blade that represents his Quincy powers. He then proceeds to demonstrate how enhanced his speed has become in this new form, as he appears within an instant in front of Orihime's barrier, as she is awestruck with how he was able to get in front of her with such a distance. So that's the first feat of enhanced power that we see demonstrated in the Horn of Salvation form. When Ichigo lunges towards Yhwach and gets into close quarters combat with him, he ends up being pushed back, but Ichigo is able to form a Getsuga Tensho, but surprisingly he fuses it with a Grand Ray Sero, as he fires this combined ability directly towards the leader of the Quincy. Ichigo was able to utilize this ability by using his longer sword as a second horn, and with his blood being used as a catalyst, he was able to fire a Grand Ray Sero and combine it with his Getsuga Tensho. This incredible attack was powerful enough to wound Yhwach, who at this point was empowered by the Soul King. Commending Ichigo for his magnificent power, he takes Ichigo seriously as he activates the Almighty, declaring that Ichigo's opportunity to defeat him is over. After several clashes and Ichigo beginning to dual wield again, he begins falling for Yhwach's traps, and this is thanks to Yhwach being able to see into the future thanks to the Almighty. When Yhwach takes the upper hand and begins to instill despair within Ichigo, Ichigo declares that he knows all about despair, and he has overcome it time and time again, as at the end of chapter 677, he activates his Bankai while in his Horn of Salvation form, but it is chapter 678 where the real controversy regarding this form comes into play. So after Ichigo activates his Bankai in this form, we get a brand new Zanpakuto, as he is wielding one large blade with a white outer shell encasing a black blade. But this new form is so short-lived that it doesn't last for more than 2 pages, as Ichigo's Tensa Zangetsu blade is broken in 2. He is confused as to when Yhwach had broken it. The leader of the Quincy explains that he pays respect to Ichigo's powers, and that his new Tensa Zangetsu is a very formidable Bankai. It appears that Yhwach had looked into the future and had seen the real power of Ichigo's true Bankai. Deeming it to be too much of a threat to him, Yhwach had broken it in the future, thus explaining how Ichigo's new Tensa Zangetsu blade was broken in 2 within the space of 1 page. Now, as much as I can try to explain this, there is no justifying it. What was done here was incredibly rushed. It didn't match up to my expectations, and I for one know that chapter 678 caused a lot of controversy when it dropped. Yhwach then takes away all of the hype from this Horn of Salvation form by snapping off this horn and firing it right back towards Ichigo. So going back to the enhancements that Ichigo had demonstrated while in this form, we have already mentioned the enhanced speed that he had demonstrated. He also demonstrates his enhanced strength while he is battling Yhwach. We see Ichigo utilize one hand to restrain the arm of Yhwach to prevent him from using his sword. And in the next page, after swinging his sword, the force that is generated is powerful enough to destroy a large chunk of the tower. Immediately after Ichigo activates this form, he also demonstrates his incredible spiritual pressure when he exerts it, and he destroys the Wandenreich's main base of operations, Silburn, which is located on top of Waterworld. It is after he does this that Yhwach refers to his Horn of Salvation form as magnificent. All of these enhancements are similar to when Ichigo used to don his Hollow Mask, and it used to improve his combat abilities and his overall power. So after discussing the Horn of Salvation form, there is one interesting potential for the future. Would it be possible for Ichigo to disrupt the balance of his powers in the other direction? Once he is able to gain more control over his powers, is it possible for him to disrupt the Quincy side of his powers and to bring them forth, since his Hollow and Quincy powers are now merged and are recognized as Zangetsu? And down the line, is it possible for Ichigo to activate both of these sides of his powers simultaneously, resulting in him being able to utilize the true extent of his Hollow and Quincy powers together? Now that's just me speaking theoretically, but during the final few chapters of the manga, we got to see Ichigo's new Bankai Tensa Zangetsu, and the true power or ability of it was hinted at through Yhwach's fear of it, so much so that he went into the future and destroyed it there, so that Ichigo could no longer utilize it in the present. After seeing the Horn of Salvation form and Ichigo activating his Bankai in this form, it leaves you really desperate to see more. I know that a lot of people have been theorizing the true power of Ichigo's new Bankai for years now, and maybe we'll get it revealed at some point in the future, especially with the Bleach manga continuing with the New Hell arc, and the anime returning to adapt the 1000 Year Blood War arc. Now, from Kubo's comments that he has made thus far, it is evident that he is heavily involved with the production of the anime, and we have recently learned that there is a possibility to adapt the light novels into the anime. So with this possibility, I'm pretty confident that the appearance of the Horn of Salvation within the anime will be expanded upon. I really want to see Ichigo use this new form for more than just a handful of chapters. I want more of an explanation as to how the balance of his powers work. Just because he had tipped the scale into one direction, is he able to do it towards the other? What other abilities does he have aside from the Grand Grey Sero Getsuga Tensho? The Horn of Salvation form took us all by surprise, and it was an incredibly hyped transformation, but in the end it went away as quickly as it came. Kubo's official fan club, Club Outside, appears to be the gift that keeps on giving. Through the question and answer section of the website, we've had some answers to some pressing questions regarding Bleach, but this is the first time that we've had a question about the nature of Ichigo Zanpakuto in its final form. In this video, we're going to discuss the dual nature of Zangetsu, why Zangetsu had returned to a single blade at the end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and during the recently released New Breeds from Hell chapter. This is going to be a very exciting Bleach breakdown and explain video, because we're discussing a topic that Kubo has never mentioned before in detail. So with the help of Kubo's comments, let's explain the final form of Ichigo Zanpakuto, Zangetsu. For the sake of context, let's briefly talk about the changes that occur with Ichigo Zanpakuto during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, so that we can understand the new dual-bladed form of Ichigo Zanpakuto. So when Ichigo's Bankai is broken at the hands of Yhwach, he quickly learns that he did not possess the true form of his Zanpakuto. Instead, he had been wielding a blade from his inherited fusion of his Shinigami and Hollow powers. When Old Man Zangetsu relinquishes the hold that he has on Ichigo's powers, he is then able to finally have his Zanpakuto personally reforged by the creator of the Zanpakuto, Uetsu Nimaya. Ichigo's new Zanpakuto had actually been forged within Asuchi. In chapter 547, we learned that the true form of Ichigo's Zanpakuto takes the shape of two separate, complete black blades. Now, this form that we see in chapter 547 is referred to as Ichigo's Zanpakuto's true Shikai form. Now, one of the blades that Ichigo is wielding is roughly the same size as Ichigo's previous Zanpakuto. One important detail to note about this new blade is that there is a thin hollowed out segment which runs from the base of the blade all the way down to the middle of it. Now, this is a important detail that we're going to come back to when we discuss how Ichigo activates his Bankai in this new Shikai form. Now, in the other hand, Ichigo is wielding a second, much smaller blade. It resembles more of a dagger than a complete sword. This blade has an enclosed handle, and unlike the larger blade, it is completely filled. Each of these blades represents a different part of Ichigo's powers. The larger blade represents Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers combined, whereas the smaller blade represents Old Man Zangetsu, which of course was Ichigo's manifestation of his Quincy powers. In chapter 678, we see how Ichigo activates his Bankai in his new Shikai state. He does so by placing the two blades of his Shikai side by side. This results in a surge of energy engulfing the swords. This reveals a totally new form of Tensar Zangetsu, where we have a black portion running through the middle of it, and the outer portion of the blade is encased in this white shell. Now, the changes that occur to Ichigo's Zanpakuto in chapter 684 confuses a lot of people, and admittedly, it had even confused me the first time that I had read this chapter. Now, when Yhwach attempts to destroy Ichigo's Tensar Zangetsu for the second time during their final battle, something very important happens here. Instead of all of the sword breaking, only the outer white portion of the sword breaks off, thus revealing a blade that is completely identical to the original form of Ichigo's Shikai, Zangetsu. Now, there is a misconception that we need to clear, and it's the belief that Ichigo no longer has his Quincy and Hollow powers because Yhwach had absorbed them in chapter 680. We see these black veins surround Ichigo as he realizes that his Quincy and Hollow powers have faded away. While it is true that Ichigo's powers had been absorbed here, this situation appears to have been remedied by the intervention of both Orihime and Tsukishima. Thanks to Tsukishima, the past had been altered, thus reverting Ichigo's Zanpakuto to a time before Yhwach had stolen his Hollow and Quincy powers, thus allowing Orihime to restore Tensar Zangetsu to its original state, meaning that when Ichigo had confronted Yhwach in his final encounter, he had all of his abilities and Bankai restored. So this now brings us to the question that was presented to Kubo on Club Outside. The individual asks Kubo, why is it that Zangetsu had returned to a single blade? They even theorize if this is because Yhwach had stolen Ichigo's Quincy and Hollow powers, resulting in Ichigo being unable to return to his dual-bladed state. Personally, this is how I had theorized the change in Ichigo's Zanpakuto prior to getting this answer from Kubo and researching for this video. Now, the question concludes by asking Kubo if if it is possible for Ichigo to return to his dual-bladed Shikai state. Kubo answers the question by saying that although this hasn't been touched upon in detail, since I don't plan on expanding upon this topic any further, I'm going to answer your question here. The dual Zangetsu is made up of the blade and the scabbard. The correct form of a Zanpakuto is one that includes a scabbard, and there are only two blades without one. The first being Sayafushi, which of course is the Zanpakuto of Uetsu Nimaya, and the second is Zangetsu, which we know is Ichigo Zanpakuto. The dual blade state fixes Zangetsu into its correct form, while its Bankai state provides the scabbard, and what was seen after it had shattered is the true Zangetsu. The shattered scabbard was absorbed by Ichigo, so if he wants to, he could split it back into two, but I guess that depends on Ichigo himself. So this response has a lot to take in, and to be honest, I was still confused until I had started researching for this video. Now let's break down each segment of this response and try to understand what Kubo means. So we know that Ichigo's dual-bladed Zanpakuto is made up of a blade and a scabbard. Now this is fascinating, and it's a new point that Kubo mentions that is so easily overlooked within the manga. I personally had never paid attention to any of the Shinigami scabbards. Now with this information, we learned that a Zanpakuto is made up of two components, the blade and its scabbard. It's not just the blade on its own, which I and others I'm sure had assumed. This ends up explaining why Ikkaku holds his Zanpakuto in one hand and his scabbard in the other, and he brings them together in order to activate his Shikai. I really had no idea that both parts form the Zanpakuto, and it is fascinating to learn this from Kubo. So Kubo continues by saying that the only two Zanpakuto without a scabbard are Sayafushi, which is Uetsu Nimaya's Zanpakuto, and Zangetsu. Now this of course is referring to the state of Ichigo's Zanpakuto prior to training with Uetsu Nimaya, because after Ichigo completes his training, we see the dual-bladed state of Zangetsu, which Kubo refers to as its correct form. Now when it comes to Uetsu Nimaya, he was unable to create a scabbard for his Zanpakuto, and it is for this reason that he considers his Zanpakuto to be incomplete. Now this further emphasizes the importance of a scabbard. Now paying attention to the dual-bladed Shikai state of Ichigo, we can see that the long sword forms the scabbard and the short sword is the blade. The dual blade state makes Ichigo very unique because the two parts of his Zanpakuto are separated, but when Ichigo activates his Bankai, he places the short sword on top of the long sword, thus transforming it into his new Tensar Zangetsu blade. Now in this completed form of Tensar Zangetsu, we can see an inner black portion which is surrounded by a white shell. The white is in fact the Zanpakuto scabbard, while the black is the blade. So when the white shell or the scabbard of Tensar Zangetsu is broken, it reveals the true form of Zangetsu underneath. The outside white portion of Ichigo's Bankai was broken by Yhwach's final blow. This white shell had represented Ichigo's Quincy powers shattering, but we learned from Kubo that these Quincy powers had been reabsorbed into Ichigo, and at the same time he had continued swinging this newly revealed real Zangetsu, which represents Ichigo's hollow and Shinigami powers. Now this blade takes the form of the very familiar Shikai Zangetsu that we have seen Ichigo use throughout the series, and it's the form that Yhwach has a dream of when he sees Ichigo defeat him. So when the white scabbard that was shattered ended up being reabsorbed back into Ichigo, this had also changed the shape of his Zanpakuto in its Shikai state. Now Kubo ambiguously states that it is now up to Ichigo whether if he wants to return the shape of his Zanpakuto into the dual-bladed Shikai state, or to just leave it in its current form that we see during the end of the 1000-year Blood War arc and the New Breeds from Hell chapter. So to now finally answer all of your questions, why did Ichigo Zanpakuto not return to its dual-bladed form? Well, it's because Ichigo doesn't feel like it. And no, this isn't a mistake on Kubo's part. He didn't forget to draw the dual-bladed Shikai form. This was an intentional choice by Kubo. Ichigo has in his possession all of his powers, so it makes sense if he is able to form them and use them however he chooses to. After learning about all of this, I honestly pray that this is expanded upon within the anime adaptation, and I really want to learn more about this and see it explained within the story in some capacity, even if Kubo explains it in the new Hell arc that he is releasing. Ichigo is a very unique Shinigami in that he possesses a Zanpakuto that has Quincy, Shinigami, and Hollow powers, so it is understandable that the nature of his powers and the form of his Zanpakuto can be somewhat confusing. Prior to receiving this answer from Kubo, I had even come up to wrong conclusions about Ichigo's Zanpakuto, and I'm so grateful for Club Outside for providing us with this answer. I know that at the time of uploading this video, this was a pretty old topic, but I wanted to properly understand Kubo's answer and to research this for myself instead of rushing out and making a video on it. After the conclusion of the Bleach manga, it is safe to say that there were a lot of unanswered questions and areas for speculation. One of the biggest mysteries that fuels most of the criticisms for the ending of Bleach Online is the fact that we never get to learn about what the true power of Ichigo's Bankai was. We did get to see Ichigo activate his true Bankai in chapter 678, but it was very short-lived, having being taken out by Yhwach just one page later. The aim of this video is to dive into some of the theories and discussions surrounding the power of Ichigo's true Bankai. We will use various points from the manga to back up the theories that are proposed in this video, including referencing how fearful Yhwach was of his true Bankai form. He was so afraid that he had no choice but to eliminate it only moments after it was activated, meaning that he has in fact seen multiple futures where he was defeated by the power of Ichigo's true Bankai. So without further delay, let's discuss the hidden power of Ichigo's true Tensei Zangetsu blade, a power so fearsome that Yhwach did not want to even risk fighting against it. Before we can speculate and theorize about the power of the true final form of Tensei Zangetsu, let's discuss everything that we know about it thus far from its brief appearance within the manga. In chapter 678, Ichigo speaks to Yhwach about how he has overcome despair time and time again. This is before he raises both of his blades in the air, one on top of the other, as he activates his true Bankai form for the first time. After a burst of energy, his dual blades merge into a large blade as it takes up the shape of a smaller black blade which is encased in a white outer shell. Now this form of the new Tensei Zangetsu was immediately destroyed by Yhwach, but after his Zanpakuto is restored thanks to the combined efforts of Tsukishima and Orihime, we see his new Tensei Zangetsu once again, as he unleashes an incredible enhanced Getsuga Tensho against the monstrous Yhwach, who at this stage had his powers enhanced after he had absorbed the Soul King. This stronger Getsuga Tensho is a golden blast of energy that was strong enough to cut the leader of the Quincy into two. This single attack did in fact kill Yhwach, but thanks to his powers of the Almighty, he was able to reverse his own death. Now something fascinating happens to Ichigo Zanpakuto in chapter 684, after Yhwach survives the attack and returns to restart the collapse of the human world, Soul Society and Hueco Mundo. Then following Uryu firing the still silver arrowhead through Yhwach's heart, Ichigo is given the perfect opportunity to kill Yuha as he charges towards him with his new Tensei Zangetsu blade. The leader of the Quincy attempts to break his sword for the second time, but it ends up only breaking the white outer casing, revealing underneath it a blade that resembles Ichigo's original Shikai Zanpakuto Zangetsu, the very form that I have referenced in previous videos as his false Shikai. Now I'm pretty sure that you can understand where all of this confusion about Ichigo's powers is stemming from. Firstly, his new Tensei Zangetsu blade is revealed to take up two forms, and secondly, we were never told what the power of Ichigo's true Bankai is. Just what on earth was Yhwach so afraid of? Aside from the fact that his new Bankai is really sharp and it can cut really well, what is the true power of his blade? If you recall, Ichigo had all of his Quincy and Hollow powers absorbed by Yhwach in chapter 680, but thanks to Tsukishima, he had these aspects of his powers restored. This was a crucial part of him being able to use the new form of his Tensei Zangetsu again, because Ichigo's Bankai is in fact a combination of all of the different powers that he has exhibited throughout the series. His newly completed Bankai incorporates his Hollow powers via the horn that grows out of his head, which allows him to fire Seros. His Fullbring powers, which we know involves the ability to create objects or manipulate the shape of them with Reiatsu, which he does to form the armor around his body. His inherited Shinigami powers allow Ichigo to channel his Reiatsu into his Zanpakuto, so this gives him control of his internal power, while contrastingly, his inherited Quincy powers allow him to control and absorb Reishi from outside of his body. All of these separate core components of his true Bankai come together to make his Tensei Zangetsu a fairly broken Zanpakuto. However, these individual aspects of his powers and how they are exhibited don't still explain the singular main power of his true Bankai. After years of theorizing and speculating, I believe that the power to overcome despair by shattering the grinding gears of fate is in fact the power of his new Bankai. This allows him to reject fate in a similar way to Orihime, who has a complementary power to Ichigo, which is to reject phenomenon itself. This is how Orihime is allowed to defend herself with her barriers or heal any fatal injuries. There were a lot of fans who were disappointed by the sudden defeat of Yhwach because of the confusing appearance of Ichigo's original Shikai Zanpakuto, but I have explained why this sword had appeared in an earlier video on my channel, where I talk about what had happened to Ichigo Zanpakuto at the end of Bleach. I believe that the true power of his Bankai has been foreshadowed within Bleach years before its reveal, via Chapter 0, which was published at the end of volume 23. Here we learn about Ichigo's desire, and in hindsight how it is pretty plausible to correlate this to the power of Ichigo's true Bankai form. Throughout Bleach, the character of Ichigo is intrinsically linked to the theme of shattering fate. He says this himself to Yhwach, that he has overcome despair time time and time again. Somehow Ichigo has always been able to overcome impossible obstacles, as he proves throughout the story of Bleach that he can fight against the grinding gears of fate and not be at the mercy of the cruelty of predetermined destiny. This idea that Ichigo's ultimate power is to shatter fate is prevalent amongst fans, and I tend to agree with them and believe that the power of his true Bankai is to wield a blade powerful enough to shatter fate. During the official Bleach prequel titled Chapter 0 Side A The Sand, we learn about Ichigo's feelings prior to the start of the series, and what he had experienced leading up to his fateful encounter with Rukia in Chapter 1 of the manga. Side A The Sand follows an average day in the life of Ichigo. At the end of the school day, his friends try to talk to him about a TV show, but he has a disinterested expression on his face, that is until he senses that something has happened. This is where the poem begins, as Ichigo leaves school in a hurry. He arrives at his destination to discover spots of blood on the ground, as an elderly spirit tells Ichigo that the boy is gone. Ichigo can do nothing but to helplessly agree with the old man. He says to himself that he can see ghosts, touch them, and even speak to them, but this is all that he could do for them. Sometimes they disappear without warning, like the spirit of this little boy that Ichigo had wanted to give a toy aeroplane to. He says that he doesn't know what happens to them, but sometimes they leave behind spots of blood that only he can see, and there is always this lingering smell of fear. He then admits to himself that no matter how strong he may get, he is unable to protect them. Now, this defeated expression on Ichigo's face should convey to you how much this means to him. Without any words, you can tell that he is deeply impacted by the loss of this boy. Realizing that he is powerless and could do nothing for the boy cuts his heart like cold steel. Ichigo leaves the toy where the boy was last seen, as we later see him encounter the spirit of a little girl. He comforts and reassures her, telling her not to cry, and he promises that he will be back to visit her again. This is a breakdown of the events that occur, and now let's look at the poem, which helps us to better understand Ichigo's problem and how fate is heavily involved with it. The poem is written from Ichigo's perspective, and it begins with "The world changes, it turns. Each time it touches the sun and the moon, it takes a new shape." This is in reference to how with each rotation of the earth, passing of a day into night and vice versa, the world that we reside within changes. We are powerless to stop the world from rotating, and we cannot stop these changes from occurring. This powerlessness is spoken about in the next verse. "The only thing that does not change is my powerlessness." This beautifully complements the first verse, and it emphasizes Ichigo's desperation for wanting to grasp fate by his hands and steer it in his direction. The poem concludes with the following verses. "It's turning. If fate is a gear and we are the sand that falls between those gears, then there is nothing that we can do. So I wish for strength. If I cannot protect them from the grinding gears of fate, then give me a strong blade and enough strength to shatter fate." Metaphorically, our position in the world is described as our life is pulled into the direction of fate and destiny, as we have little control over what happens to us. Just like the sand that is crushed between the rotating gears, we are powerless to stop the gears and are taken in the direction that the gears are rotating towards. Ichigo has seen how cruel fate can be, and it's for this reason that he wishes for the strength to not just protect his loved ones from fate, but to shatter it completely. Now ultimately, it was thanks to Rukia that he had gained power in the first place, and for once he was finally able to fight against fate. He was no longer powerless, and he had consequently intervened when his family were threatened by the hollow Fishbone D, similar to how his mother was attacked by the Grand Fisher, but now he can do something about it. No longer does he have to helplessly stand by, as the spirits that he encounters are inevitably devoured by hollows. Ichigo Zanpakuto allows him to cut through fate and overcome the odds in impossible situations. The crushing gears of fate were broken by Ichigo. His wish to receive a blade strong enough to shatter fate was fulfilled. Thus, fighting against fate and destiny becomes an intrinsic theme which always resurfaces within the pages of Bleach. We see the idea of fate brought up during Ichigo's battle against Byakuya, Ukiura, Aizen, and even Yhwach. As long as he is wielding his blade, he is able to protect the weak and resist against the crushing gears of fate. During the 1000-year Blood War arc, Yhwach had stated that he has destroyed every Bankai in the future, and that there is no power in this world that can defeat him, as he has already overcome it in every possible future that he has seen. And this is thanks to the powers of the Almighty, which in a way are a physical manifestation of predetermined fate and destiny, as he himself states that there is nothing in the world that he has not already seen and overcome. His ability allows him to alter the future to affect his immediate present, thus explaining how he has instantly destroyed Ichigo's new Tensei Zangetsu blade just one page after it was revealed. From this one precautionary act, we can only begin to imagine how powerful the full extent of Ichigo's new Bankai must be. Yhwach had ultimately failed because he had ignored the vision of the future, where he was actually defeated by Ichigo. In chapter 672, a key piece of foreshadowing is dropped, where Yhwach has a vision that he mistakes to be a nightmare, where he briefly sees that he is confronted by Ichigo in his false Shikai form, the very form that he had taken up after he had awakened his own Shinigami powers following the Shattered Shaft training with Urahara right at the start of Bleach. It was this iconic original Shikai Zanpakuto form that Ichigo had first wielded during the invasion of the Soul Society. This was the blade that he had used, which had given him the power to cut through fate and to rescue Rukia. It is iconic not only in appearance, but because it was the first form that he had taken up after having activated some aspect of his own inherited power, because up until that point in the series, he was using powers that he had borrowed from Rukia. Chapter 672 shows us Ichigo wielding his original Shikai blade to kill Yhwach, the very blade that had manifested in chapter 684 and was actually used to defeat him. Now, I may just be reading between the lines too much, but this is what I think of when I try to imagine where Kubo was going in terms of Ichigo's powers and the thematic direction of his character. While everyone else's Zanpakutos and powers are fairly straightforward and are explained in the series, on the other hand, Ichigo's powers and forms have been ever-changing and constantly evolving. Gradually, he incorporated a new side to his power with every form that he had taken up and each power that he had awakened, which was kind of like a stepping stone leading up to the reveal of his true Bankai and true Shikai. I refer to these forms as true because they combine all aspects of his power. This is what sets Ichigo's Bankai apart from everyone else's in the series. Throughout the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Ichigo's Bankai was hinted at being special ever since Ebern and Kilgay had failed to steal it at the start of the series, all the way up until Yhwach had deemed it to be too dangerous to even contend with. Yhwach did say that he had eliminated every Bankai in the future, but he still was willing to entertain them to some extent. Like during his encounter with Yamamoto or Ichibei, he did not end up destroying their Zanpakuto upon their Bankai activations. However, when it comes to Ichigo's Zanpakuto, it appears to be an exception, as his blade was the only one that Yhwach had actively tried to break in almost every encounter that he has with him. Even at the start of the arc, when Ichigo first encounters Yhwach, we see that Hashward ends up breaking his Tensai Zangetsu into two in chapter 515. While Yhwach's ability, the Almighty, may be the most broken power within Bleach, through my speculating and theorizing, we can appreciate the power of Ichigo's true Bankai and understand how it is one of the most hacks powers in the series, even being able to overcome the Almighty. For now, all we have is theories and speculation as for the actual power of Ichigo's new Tensai Zangetsu. We may get to learn more about it if Kubo feels like continuing his work via the upcoming Hell arc of the Bleach manga. Additionally, with the way that we are getting more context and extended scenes within the anime adaptation of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, there is every possibility that Ichigo's new Bankai will be elaborated upon in anime form, especially if the final battle against Yhwach is expanded upon. Now, we've reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What do you think about the true power of Ichigo's new Tensai Zangetsu? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I look forward to reading about if you agree or disagree with my thoughts and speculation. Lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I can't wait to see you in my next Bleach video. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.